By 1910, a single distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee was producing more than 20,000 barrels a year, shipping whiskey to 6 continents, selling bottles for $1.25 that would one day define American rebellion. But on a quiet morning in 1911, its founder, Jack Daniel, arrived early, forgot the combination to his office safe, and kicked it in anger. The steel door didn't budge. His toe shattered. That small injury triggered blood poisoning that killed him slowly over 6 years. The whiskey empire survived Prohibition, federal raids, and global war, but its creator died penniless, locked out of the fortune he built. This is the story of how stubborn pride outlived genius, and why some empires kill their founders long before the market ever does. A boy, a cave, and a recipe. Born in the 1840s to a poor Tennessee family, yet Jack Daniel learned early that authority belonged to whoever controlled the tools. His mother died when he was young. His father remarried a woman who made it clear Jack wasn't wanted. By age 7, he was working odd jobs around Lynchburg, a town of maybe 300 souls carved into the limestone hills of Moore County. The Civil War hadn't started yet. Tennessee was still figuring out whether whiskey was sin or commerce, and young Jack, barely tall enough to see over a grain sack, was figuring out how to eat. He found his answer in a man named Dan Call. Call was a curiosity in those parts. A Lutheran preacher who also ran a whiskey still, he saw no contradiction between Sunday sermons and weekday distilling. His operation sat on a plot near Lynchburg where cold spring water emerged from a cave, flowing at roughly 3,000 gallons per day, year-round, through limestone that filtered out iron and left behind minerals that softened grain mash. Call needed help. Jack needed purpose. By age 10, Jack Daniel was hauling wood, stoking fires, and learning that whiskey wasn't magic. It was measurement, temperature, and relentless attention to detail. The apprenticeship wasn't formal. There were no papers, no contracts. Just a boy watching an older man turn corn into cash, batch after batch, learning that consistency earned trust, and trust earned money. Calls still produced maybe 20 to 30 barrels a month, sold locally to farmers and merchants who paid in coin or trade. It was small-scale manufacturing in an era when most commerce still happened face-to-face. Jack absorbed the rhythm, mash the grain, ferment with yesterday's spent mash to control acidity, distill twice for purity, in age and charred oak barrels. Repeat, never deviate. By his mid-teens, Jack essentially ran the operation. Call, pressured by his congregation to choose between pulpit and profit, began stepping back from the whiskey business. The church didn't approve of a preacher smelling like sour mash 6 days a week. In 1863 or 1864, records from that period are sparse. The county clerk's office having burned during the war, Call sold the still to Jack Daniel and a partner named Calloway. Jack was maybe 17 years old, barely shaving, already certain he understood the one thing that mattered. Control the process, control your fate. What Call sold wasn't just copper stills and oak barrels. It was access to that cave spring, the entire foundation of the operation. Limestone water mattered because iron-heavy water turned whiskey dark and bitter. This water came out of the ground at a constant 56 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for cooling distillate and diluting whiskey to bottling proof without shocking the flavor. Jack knew he'd never find another spring like it. He bought Calloway out within a couple years, acquiring sole ownership of the distillery sometime around 1865 or 1866. Then he did something almost no one in Tennessee had done. he registered the operation with the federal government. The Internal Revenue Act of 1862 had created new licensing requirements for distilleries, part of the Union's effort to fund the Civil War through alcohol taxes. By 1866, Tennessee was crawling back toward normalcy, and Jack Daniel walked into whatever passed for a federal revenue office in that region and declared his business official. Registration number, unknown. Location, Lynchburg, Moore County, Tennessee. Population still under 500. Acreage, roughly 2 acres of hillside, stills, and storage. The license cost him maybe $25, a significant sum, but it meant legitimacy. It meant he wasn't some backwoods bootlegger. He was a manufacturer. He was also alone. Jack never married, never had children. Contemporary accounts describe him as short, maybe 5'2", impeccably dressed in dark suits and a planter's hat that added illusory height. He lived in a small house adjacent to the distillery property, close enough to hear the stills at night. His social circle consisted of workers, suppliers, and the occasional traveling salesman. What he lacked in family, he replaced with fanatical devotion to the whiskey itself. Every barrel that left his property carried his personal approval. If a batch tasted off, too harsh, too sweet, inconsistent, he dumped it. Workers learned quickly. Jack Daniel's standard was Jack Daniel. There was no committee, no consensus. The product was the extension of his will. By 1870, annual production had climbed to perhaps 600 to 800 barrels, modest but growing. Prices hovered around 75 cents to $1 per bottle, competitive with other regional whiskeys, but not yet premium. Jack employed maybe a dozen men, paying them roughly $1 to $1.25 per day for 12-hour shifts. They worked 6 days a week, resting on Sunday, not because Jack was religious, but because even he understood fires needed banking and men needed sleep. The labor was brutal. Hauling grain sacks, stoking coal furnaces, rolling barrels, cleaning mash tanks that reeked of fermentation. But in rural Tennessee after the war, $6 a week was stability. Men stayed. What Jack built in those early years wasn't just a business. It was proof that poverty could be escaped through mastery. He'd started with nothing. No inheritance, no formal education, a childhood spent being unwanted. Now he owned land, employed men, and produced a product people paid for. The hunger that drove him wasn't greed. It was the need to never be powerless again. Every decision he made reinforced the same principle. He controlled the tools, the recipe, the timeline, the outcome. Authority belonged to him because he'd earned it through obsessive competence. The distillery itself was utilitarian. Wood frame buildings, copper stills imported from somewhere up north, charred oak barrels stacked in low-slung warehouses. No architectural flourishes. Function over form. The cave spring remained the centerpiece, the unchallengeable advantage. Competitors could copy his mash bill, steal his workers, undercut his prices, but they couldn't move that spring, and Jack knew it. He was building an empire. He just didn't know yet that empires built entirely on one person's will don't survive the person. The process that would not change. Jack Daniel didn't invent whiskey, but he turned repetition into religion. By the early 1870s, distilleries across Tennessee and Kentucky were experimenting with shortcuts, faster fermentation cycles using commercial yeast, thinner barrels to speed aging, cheaper grains to boost margins. The post-war economy rewarded volume, and most distillers chased it. Jack Daniel watched his competitors rush, and he slowed down. The decision that would define his whiskey and eventually cage him was the Lincoln County process, a filtration method he inherited from Dan Call and then codified into absolute law. Before whiskey entered barrels for aging, Jack ran it through 10 feet of sugar maple charcoal, drip by slow drip, a mellowing process that could take 10 to 14 days per batch. The charcoal absorbed harsh congeners and fusel oils, smoothing the spirit in ways aging alone couldn't match. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It reduced annual output by perhaps 15 to 20% compared to distilleries that skipped filtration entirely. Jack didn't care. He'd tasted the difference. The charcoal itself required precision. Sugar maple, not oak or hickory, burned at specific temperatures to create the right porosity. Stacked in massive vats called mellowing tanks, in each one holding roughly 400 to 500 gallons of new-make whiskey that trickled through at maybe 2 gallons per hour. Workers monitored flow rates constantly. Too fast, and the filtration failed. Too slow, and production backed up, idling stills and wasting time. Jack walked the mellowing room daily, tasting samples, checking clarity, ensuring no one had adjusted the drip valves to speed things along. He paired the Lincoln County process with sour mash fermentation, another technique that prized consistency over speed. Instead of starting each batch with fresh yeast, Jack reserved a portion of spent mash from the previous fermentation, still rich with live yeast and lactic acid bacteria, and added it to the new batch. The acidity controlled wild yeast and bacteria that could spoil flavor. It also created continuity. Every batch carried genetic material from the one before, a biological chain stretching back to Dan Call's original culture. Fermentation took 4 to 5 days, slower than the 3-day cycles some competitors ran. But the pH stayed stable, the flavor predictable. Then came the water, drawn from Cave Spring at 56 degrees Fahrenheit, flowing at roughly 800 gallons per hour through limestone aquifers that had been filtering rainfall for centuries. Iron content, nearly 0. Mineral profile, calcium and magnesium that enhanced yeast activity without adding metallic notes. Jack used this water for everything, mashing grain, cutting distillate to barrel proof, diluting whiskey for bottling. He tested other water sources occasionally, wells and creeks around Lynchburg, but nothing matched the spring. It wasn't sentimentality. It was chemistry he couldn't replicate. The grain bill was simple: 80% corn, 12% malted barley, 8% rye. Standard for Tennessee whiskey. Jack bought corn locally when he could, paying farmers maybe 40 to 50 cents per bushel, but he'd import from Kentucky or Indiana if local crops failed. Quality mattered more than proximity. He rejected moldy grain, insect-damaged kernels, anything that might introduce off flavors. Workers learned to anticipate his inspections. Jack would grab a handful of corn from a delivery wagon, bite a kernel, spit it out, and either nod approval or send the entire load back. By 1875, the distillery was producing roughly 1,200 barrels annually, aged a minimum of 2 years in new charred oak. Jack paid coopers between $1.50 and $2 per barrel, a significant cost when competitors were reusing barrels or aging for shorter periods. But new charred oak imparted vanilla, caramel, and spice notes that defined his flavor profile. He'd taste barrels at 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, selecting the moment each batch peaked. Some whiskey sat 3 years if he felt it needed more time. There was no formula for this decision, just Jack's palate and his refusal to bottle anything that disappointed him. Workers operated on 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, earning between $1.25 and $1.75 per day, depending on skill level. Master distillers, the men who managed fermentation and ran the stills, made closer to $2 per day, roughly $12 per week, enough to support a family modestly. The work was dangerous. Steam boilers occasionally exploded. Men fell into mash tanks. Burns from hot distillate were common. Jack offered no insurance, no injury compensation beyond a few days paid rest. If a man couldn't work, he didn't earn. That was the deal, and no one questioned it. Jobs were scarce. Jack's distillery was steady. What emerged from this rigidity was a product that tasted the same year after year. Customers in Nashville could buy a bottle in 1873 and another in 1876 and find identical flavor. In an industry plagued by inconsistency, where some distilleries literally watered down whiskey or added prune juice for color, Jack Daniel's became synonymous with reliability. Merchants reordered because they knew what they were selling. Drinkers became loyal because they knew what they were buying. But here's what Jack wouldn't acknowledge. The process that ensured quality also ensured limitation. The Lincoln County process capped his production ceiling. 10 feet of charcoal, dripping at 2 gallons per hour, meant each mellowing tank could process maybe 50 gallons per day. Jack ran perhaps 6 to 8 tanks simultaneously, maxing out at 300 to 400 gallons of mellowed whiskey daily. To double production, he'd need double the tanks, double the charcoal, double the labor to monitor flow rates. He'd need to expand buildings, hire supervisors, delegate authority over quality decisions he currently made himself. He'd need to trust someone else to taste the whiskey and decide when it was ready. He refused. When a Louisville distributor approached him in 1877 offering to triple his order if Jack could deliver 3,000 barrels annually, Jack said no. Not because he couldn't physically expand. He had the capital, the land, the access to labor, but because expansion meant relinquishing control. It meant hiring a second master distiller whose palate might differ from his. It meant trusting workers he didn't personally know to maintain standards he'd spent 15 years perfecting. The distributor went to a competitor. Jack didn't regret it. His workers saw the decision differently. Nathan Nearest Green, a formerly enslaved man who'd taught Jack some of the finer points of distilling during his apprenticeship with Dan Call, now worked as Jack's head distiller. Green understood the process as well as Jack did, maybe better given his longer experience. He managed fermentation, supervised still operations, and trained new workers in the methodical approach Jack demanded. Green earned $2 per day, the highest wage in the distillery, respected by both Jack and the crew. But when Green suggested hiring his sons to help expand capacity, Jack hesitated. Not from prejudice. Jack employed Green's family members and paid them fairly by local standards, but from fear of diluting quality through growth. The distillery remained small by design, 2 acres, fewer than 20 workers by 1880. Output plateaued around 1,500 barrels annually, enough to supply markets in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and parts of Kentucky. Prices held steady at $1 to $1.25 per bottle, competitive but not premium. Jack's profit margins were healthy, perhaps 30 to 40% after materials, labor, and taxes, but he reinvested most earnings into barrels, charcoal, and incremental improvements to existing equipment. He didn't seek investors, didn't incorporate. The business was his, wholly owned, answerable to no one. What he was building, without realizing it, was a trap disguised as a virtue. Every time he rejected expansion to maintain quality, he reinforced the belief that only he could ensure excellence. Every time he personally approved a barrel or rejected a batch, he taught his workers that final authority resided in one man's judgment. The distillery wasn't becoming an institution with systems and succession plans. It was becoming a monument to Jack Daniel's refusal to compromise. And monuments, unlike businesses, don't adapt. They endure until something breaks them. By 1880, Jack was in his mid-30s, unmarried, living alone in a house that smelled perpetually of oak and charcoal smoke. His entire identity had fused with the distillery. He had no hobbies, no travel, no social life beyond business relationships. Workers respected him but didn't know him. He was the man who paid on time, demanded perfection, and never explained his decisions. If you asked why the whiskey dripped through 10 feet of charcoal instead of 8, Jack would say, "Because that's the way it's done." The process had become sacred, not because it was optimal, but because it was his. The pride he felt wasn't arrogance, not yet. It was the satisfaction of a craftsman who'd escaped poverty by mastering one thing completely. He'd turned repetition into profit, discipline into reputation. The Lincoln County process wasn't just a manufacturing step. It was proof that his way worked, that his standards mattered, that he'd been right to reject shortcuts. He just didn't see that the same pride protecting his product was slowly isolating him from the human capacity to change and selling an attitude. By the 1890s, Jack Daniel's wasn't just whiskey. It was an identity in a bottle. The transformation started with packaging. In 1895, Jack made a decision that would outlast him by more than a century. He switched from standard round bottles to square ones. The reason was purely practical. Square bottles packed tighter in shipping crates, reducing breakage and cutting freight costs by roughly 15%. But the visual effect was unmistakable. On a shelf crowded with round bottles of indistinguishable brown liquid, Jack Daniel's stood out. It looked deliberate, structured, different. Then came the label, black with white lettering, simple and stark, listing Jack Daniel's Old Number, 7 Tennessee Whiskey, in bold type. No ornate scripts, no pastoral scenes of happy farmers, and no claims of medicinal benefits that cluttered competitors' bottles. Just the name, the number, and Lynchburg, Tennessee. The Old Number 7 designation had murky origins. Some said it referred to a batch number. Others claimed it was Jack's lucky number. A few insisted it marked a specific recipe. Jack never clarified. The mystery became part of the appeal. He priced the whiskey at $1.25 per bottle by 1895, a 25-cent premium over most regional competitors selling for $1 or less. That extra quarter communicated something beyond cost. This wasn't everyday whiskey. This was whiskey for men who cared about what they drank, who saw their choice of spirit as a statement about standards and taste. Jack wasn't selling alcohol. He was selling an attitude, the idea that quality justified cost, that shortcuts were contemptible. Yeah, that excellence required discipline. The strategy worked because the product backed it up. By 1898, annual production had climbed to roughly 8,000 barrels, still modest compared to large Kentucky distilleries producing 20,000 or more, but significant for an operation that had started with maybe 600 barrels in 1870. Jack employed approximately 40 workers now, paying skilled positions $2 to $2.50 per day, while basic laborers earned $1.50. The distillery sprawled across roughly 10 acres, with new warehouse buildings to accommodate aging inventory that now exceeded 15,000 barrels at various stages of maturation. Cave Spring still provided all the water, flowing continuously, the foundation of everything. Distribution had expanded to nearly 30 states, concentrated in the South and Midwest, but reaching into Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Jack worked with wholesalers and distributors who understood they were selling premium product, not volume liquor. He rejected proposals to discount for bulk orders, a position that frustrated some partners but reinforced brand perception. A saloon owner in Memphis couldn't buy Jack Daniel's for 90 cents and sell it for $1.10. The price held firm, and that firmness communicated value. Then came the medals. In 1904, Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey won a gold medal at the World's Fair in St. Louis, competing against hundreds of spirits from around the globe. The fair drew nearly 20 million visitors over 7 months, showcasing everything from electric lights to ice cream cones, and Jack's whiskey stood out in blind tastings judged by international experts. The medal wasn't just recognition, it was ammunition. And suddenly, every bottle could claim gold medal winner, a credential that mattered to buyers who wanted assurance they were drinking something legitimately excellent, not just locally popular. Jack attended the fair himself, one of his rare trips outside Tennessee. Accounts describe him moving through the exposition grounds in his customary black suit and wide-brimmed hat, standing perhaps 5'2", but projecting authority through sheer certainty. He watched judges taste his whiskey, watched their faces register approval, and felt what he'd always known: his process worked. The Lincoln County filtration, the sour mash fermentation, the iron-free spring water, the refusal to rush aging, it all vindicated itself in that gold medal. He won again in 1905 at a fair in Liège, Belgium, and another gold medal that proved his whiskey could compete internationally. By 1906, bottles bore both medals on the label, physical proof of superiority. Sales accelerated, distribution reached roughly 20 countries, small volumes exported to Europe, South America, Australia, and parts of Asia, where American whiskey represented a certain frontier romance. Orders increased 40% between 1904 and 1907. Jack expanded warehouses again, adding capacity for another 5,000 barrels. Annual production approached 10,000 barrels by 1907, representing roughly 250,000 bottles. At $1.25 per bottle wholesale, gross revenue exceeded $300,000 annually, an enormous sum for a rural Tennessee operation. Jack's personal wealth remained modest. Most capital stayed tied up in inventory, equipment, and land. But he was undeniably successful by any measure. Workers in Lynchburg knew the distillery as the town's economic engine, the source of roughly 50 jobs paying reliable wages in a county where farming remained the primary occupation. But success was hardening Jack's convictions into something more dangerous than confidence. He refused mechanization even as competitors adopted steam-powered grain mills and automated bottling lines. At Jack Daniel's, workers still milled corn by hand-cranked grinders, filled bottles individually, corked them manually, and applied labels one at a time. The inefficiency was intentional. Jack believed machines introduced variables he couldn't control: inconsistent grinding, poorly seated corks, misaligned labels. He'd watched a demonstration of an automatic bottling machine in 1905, a device that could fill and cork 200 bottles per hour, in 10 times faster than his workers managed. He bought nothing. "A machine," he reportedly told the salesman, "doesn't taste the whiskey." When Nathan Green suggested training his grandson George to eventually take over as master distiller, allowing Nathan to semi-retire and Jack to focus on business expansion, Jack agreed in principle but structured the arrangement so final approval on every batch still required his personal sign-off. George Green learned fermentation timing, distillation temperatures, barrel selection, everything Nathan knew. But George couldn't release a barrel for bottling without Jack tasting it first. The system created a bottleneck, one that would grow more problematic as Jack aged, but he saw it as quality assurance. He also refused to document the process in writing. Workers learned through demonstration and repetition, apprenticeship style, exactly as Jack had learned from Dan Call 40 years earlier. There were no recipe books, no procedural manuals, no written specifications for charcoal depth or fermentation temperatures. When new workers asked why something was done a certain way, supervisors would say, "Because that's how Mr. Daniel does it." The knowledge lived in practice, passed person to person, anchored entirely in Jack's authority. If he died tomorrow, the distillery would continue operating, but only as long as the men who'd learned from him directly remained alive and able. Jack turned 60 around 1908, though exact birth records were unclear. He'd spent 40-plus years building the distillery, and it showed. Workers noticed he moved slower, fatigued more easily, occasionally forgot minor details he would have remembered instantly a decade prior. But he refused to slow down. He arrived before dawn most mornings, personally inspected fermentation tanks, tasted new-make whiskey coming off the stills, checked warehouse temperatures, and handled business correspondence until evening. The idea of delegating substantive decisions felt like admitting weakness. By 1910, production peaked at roughly 20,000 barrels annually, double the output of just 6 years earlier. The distillery employed approximately 150 workers, made payroll every Friday without fail, and dominated Moore County's economy. Roughly 15% of the county's total population now depended directly or indirectly on Jack Daniel's distillery for income. Suppliers, cooperatives, grain farmers, coal merchants, freight companies all thrived on Jack's consistent orders. The town of Lynchburg, still under 1,000 residents, had become synonymous with one man's whiskey. Jack owned it all. No partners, no shareholders, no board of directors. The business remained a sole proprietorship, meaning every asset, every liability, every decision resided with him. His personal wealth was difficult to calculate because it was entirely illiquid. Land, buildings, inventory, equipment, all vital to operations, but hard to convert to cash. He lived modestly, spending little on himself, reinvesting everything into capacity and quality. His house remained small, his wardrobe simple, his social life nearly non-existent. What he'd created was extraordinary by any objective measure. A globally recognized brand built from nothing, employing an entire community, producing a product that won international awards and commanded premium pricing. Distributors across 30 states carried his whiskey. Exporters shipped it to 20 countries. The square bottle with the black label had become iconic, instantly recognizable, associated with authenticity and excellence. But the empire rested on a foundation that couldn't bear its own weight much longer. The assumption that Jack Daniel would always be there, tasting every batch, approving every barrel, controlling every decision that mattered. He'd built something magnificent. He just hadn't built it to outlive him. And in Tennessee in 1909, forces were gathering that would test whether his creation could survive without its creator. The state legislature was debating Prohibition, a movement Jack dismissed as temporary political theater. Temperance advocates were gaining power, backed by churches and women's groups who saw whiskey as a social poison. Counties across Tennessee were voting themselves dry, banning alcohol sales within their borders. Moore County, home to the state's most famous distillery, would face that vote soon. Jack believed reputation would protect him. He'd won gold medals. He employed 150 men. His whiskey represented Tennessee craftsmanship to the world. Surely, he thought, legislators would recognize the difference between his operation and the cheap rot-gut saloons temperance advocates railed against. He was wrong, but he wouldn't live long enough to see just how wrong. Because one morning in 1911, he'd forget a combination, lose his temper, and destroy himself in a moment of stubborn pride that perfectly encapsulated everything he'd ever been. The distillery as a kingdom. By 1907, the Lynchburg Distillery employed over 150 workers and dominated Moore County's economy. The numbers told one story. The people living inside those numbers told another. On a typical morning, the first shift arrived at 6 a.m., walking from homes scattered across Lynchburg and the surrounding hollows. Most lived within 2 miles of the distillery, close enough to walk, far enough that the smell of sour mash didn't permeate their bedrooms. They earned between $1.50 and $2.50 per day, depending on their role, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. That translated to $9 to $15 weekly, roughly $450 to $750 annually if they worked every week without injury or illness. In a county where tenant farming might net a family $300 in a good year, distillery work represented stability, though the workforce broke into distinct tiers. At the bottom were general laborers, men who hauled grain sacks, shoveled coal into furnaces, rolled barrels, and scrubbed fermentation tanks. They earned $1.50 per day and could be replaced easily. Jack hired from the local population, both white and black workers, paying equal wages for equal work in an era when that practice was far from universal in the South. It wasn't altruism, it was pragmatism. He needed reliable labor, and he'd learned from Nathan Green that skin color had nothing to do with whether a man could manage a mash tank. Mid-tier workers, coopers, maintenance men, warehousemen, earned $2 to $2.25 daily. These were skilled positions requiring training and experience. A cooper who could assemble and char oak barrels properly was worth his wage because a poorly made barrel could ruin an entire batch of aging whiskey. Warehousemen rotated barrels, monitored temperature and humidity, and identified barrels ready for bottling based on aging time and warehouse location. They developed intuition about how whiskey matured, knowledge that couldn't be taught in a day. At the top sat perhaps 6 to 8 men who ran the actual distillation process. George Green, Nathan's grandson, managed fermentation, monitoring pH levels, yeast activity, and temperature control across multiple mash tanks simultaneously. The head distiller oversaw the copper stills, controlling heat to separate alcohol from water and congeners, a process requiring constant attention and immediate adjustment. These men earned $2.50 per day, and sometimes more, and Jack relied on them completely, though he'd never admit it. The distillery operated as a small industrial city, 15 acres of buildings, stills, warehouses, grain storage, cooperage, bottling facility, and offices. Steam boilers provided power and heat. Coal furnaces, consuming roughly 200 tons monthly, maintained fermentation temperatures and heated stills. The charcoal mellowing house held massive tanks where whiskey dripped through sugar maple charcoal at maddeningly slow rates, tended by workers who checked flow valves hourly. Barrel warehouses stretched across 3 multi-story buildings, storing approximately 25,000 barrels at various aging stages. Inventory worth perhaps $600,000 at wholesale prices. Cave Spring remained the heart of everything, flowing at 800 to 900 gallons per hour, and pumped through pipes to every part of the operation. Jack had built a small limestone spring house over the source, protecting it from contamination, maintaining the 56-degree temperature that made everything work. Workers joked that Jack cared more about that spring than any human on the property. They weren't entirely wrong. The economic impact rippled through Moore County in ways that went beyond payroll. Jack bought corn from local farmers, paying 50 to 60 cents per bushel, providing guaranteed income for perhaps 30 families who'd otherwise depend entirely on uncertain commodity markets. He purchased coal from mines in nearby counties, roughly 2,400 tons annually, sustaining those operations. Cooper supplied barrels. Jack needed approximately 20,000 new barrels yearly at $2 to $2.50 each, at contracts worth $40,000 to $50,000 annually that kept multiple cooperatives employed. Freight companies hauled finished whiskey to Nashville, Memphis, and Chattanooga, earning thousands in annual shipping fees. The distillery contributed roughly 30% of Moore County's tax revenue by 1907, funding the courthouse, roads, and what passed for public services. When Jack paid his workers on Friday afternoons, cash in hand, no delays, no excuses, that money flowed directly into Lynchburg's economy. Grocers, dry goods stores, boarding houses, and the few restaurants all depended on distillery wages. The town's fortunes and Jack Daniel's fortunes were completely intertwined. But here's what the economic data obscured. The distillery wasn't an institution. It was a kingdom with a population of 1. Jack made every decision that mattered. He set wages, hired workers, approved purchases, negotiated contracts, selected barrel suppliers, determined pricing, chose distributors, and personally tasted every batch before bottling. He had no board of directors, no partners, no advisors whose counsel he was obligated to consider. When he decided something, it happened. When he said no, the conversation ended. Workers didn't appeal his judgments. They accepted them. His office sat in a 2-story brick building adjacent to the main distillery, a modest structure with a safe where he kept business records, cash for payroll, and legal documents. He arrived most mornings by 5:30 a.m. before anyone else, and often stayed until 7 or 8 p.m., reviewing ledgers by lamplight. He had no secretary, no assistant. He wrote correspondence himself, and signing every letter with his distinctive signature. He trusted no one to speak for him or represent his business without his direct oversight. The problem with absolute authority is that it requires absolute presence. When Jack traveled, rare trips to Nashville for banking or occasional visits to distributors, production continued, but decisions accumulated. Workers would stockpile questions. Should we reject this corn shipment? Is this barrel ready for bottling? Can we hire another laborer? Everything waited for Jack's return. He'd spend a full day catching up, inspecting what had happened in his absence, second-guessing choices his foreman had made, sometimes reversing decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable. Nathan Green, who'd worked with Jack for nearly 40 years, watched this pattern with growing concern. And Nathan was in his 70s now, still working but slowing down, training his grandson George to eventually take over. Nathan understood the whiskey as well as Jack did, better in some technical aspects, but he'd learned decades ago that suggesting Jack delegate substantive authority was futile. Jack would nod, agree in principle, then continue making every final decision himself. In 1908, Nathan broached the subject directly. They were standing in the rick house, the barrel warehouse, evaluating whiskey that had aged 4 years, deciding whether to bottle it or let it sit another year. Nathan tasted a sample, pronounced it ready, and noted they had 500 barrels from this same batch, all maturing identically. Jack tasted it, agreed it was good, but wanted to taste one more barrel just to be certain. Nathan, gently, suggested that if Jack trusted George's palate, George could handle barrel selection, freeing Jack to focus on business development and sales. Jack's response was telling. He didn't get angry. He simply said, "When George has been tasting whiskey for 40 years, maybe." Nathan was 75. George was 28. In 40 years, George would be 68, and Jack would be dead. Nathan understood the implication. Jack had no intention of relinquishing control while he lived. The distillery had no succession plan, no training program to develop future leadership, no documented procedures someone could follow if Jack died tomorrow. The knowledge existed in practice. Workers knew their specific jobs, but strategic decisions, quality standards, business relationships, pricing strategies, and the overall direction of the company resided entirely in Jack's mind. He'd never written a business plan, never created an organizational chart, never formally designated anyone as second in command. His reasoning was consistent with everything he'd ever believed. The distillery was him. Its reputation was his reputation. Its quality was his personal standard. To delegate authority was to dilute that direct connection between his judgment and the product. And after 40 years of proving that his judgment worked, gold medals, premium pricing, global distribution, 20,000 barrels annually, why would he change? But 1909 brought a development Jack couldn't control through stubbornness or quality: Tennessee politics. The temperance movement had been building for years, powered by churches, women's groups, and progressive-era reformers who saw alcohol as the root of poverty, domestic violence, and moral decay. County by county, Tennessee was voting itself dry. By 1909, roughly 75 of Tennessee's 96 counties had banned alcohol sales through local option laws. The movement was coming from Moore County, home to Tennessee's most famous distillery. Jack attended a town meeting in Lynchburg in March 1909, where temperance advocates laid out their case. Alcohol destroyed families, they argued. It impoverished workers who should be saving wages, not spending them in saloons. It corrupted communities and violated Christian values. They presented statistics on domestic violence, child neglect, and public drunkenness. Their solution: ban alcohol sales in Moore County, eliminate the temptation, and let the community heal. Jack listened from the back of the room, saying nothing. He'd expected this fight eventually, but he'd assumed his distillery's economic importance would provide protection. He employed 150 men. He paid 30% of the county's taxes. He'd won gold medals representing Tennessee on the world stage. Surely the county wouldn't destroy its largest employer over moral posturing. He miscalculated the movement's power. Temperance wasn't about economics, it was about righteousness, and righteousness doesn't compromise for jobs. The vote came in November 1909. Moore County banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol by a margin of roughly 60 to 40%. The law would take effect January 1st, 1910. Jack Daniel's Distillery, 44 years old, producing 20,000 barrels annually, employing 150 workers, would be illegal in the county where it was founded. Jack's initial response was disbelief. He consulted lawyers in Nashville and looking for loopholes or legal challenges. There were none. The law was clear and constitutional under Tennessee statutes. His distillery could not legally operate in Moore County after January 1st, 1910. His options were limited and all painful. He could relocate the entire operation to a county that remained wet. But that meant abandoning Cave Spring, the foundation of his product's unique character. He could shut down production and sell aged inventory until it was depleted, essentially liquidating the business. He could challenge the law in court, a process that would take years and likely fail. Or he could pivot to producing non-alcoholic products, a suggestion so absurd he dismissed it immediately. Jack chose defiance and hope. He shut down production on January 1st, 1910, as legally required, but kept the distillery intact, an aging inventory in warehouses, maintaining equipment, and retaining key workers at reduced hours. He believed the Prohibition vote would be reversed once voters saw the economic consequences. When 150 jobs disappeared and tax revenue collapsed, surely Moore County would reconsider. But empires don't run on hope. They run on revenue, adaptation, and leadership that can navigate change. Jack had built a kingdom that depended entirely on his will, his presence, and his refusal to compromise. Now the kingdom was shuttered by forces beyond his control, and he had no infrastructure for adaptation because he'd never believed adaptation would be necessary. He was 62 years old, exhausted, and facing the possible end of everything he'd built. His entire identity was that distillery. Without it, who was he? The answer would come in the most mundane way possible. Trying to open a safe on a quiet morning in 1911, forgetting a combination, and proving that stubbornness is only strength until it kills you. Peak whiskey, peak ego. In 1910, Jack Daniel's is America's best-known whiskey, exporting to Europe and Asia. The irony was brutal. Just as Jack was forced to shut down production in Moore County, his whiskey was reaching its cultural apex. Bottles bearing the square shape and black label sat on bars from San Francisco to Singapore, from London gentlemen's clubs to Australian mining camps. The brand had transcended its Tennessee origins to become shorthand for American authenticity, the whiskey that symbolized frontier grit refined into premium product. Distribution spanned approximately 40 states by 1910. It concentrated heavily in the South and Midwest, but present in nearly every major city. Wholesale partners in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia stocked Jack Daniel's alongside Kentucky bourbons, Scotch whiskeys, and French cognacs, positioning it as premium American spirit. Retail pricing held firm at $1.25 to $1.50 per bottle, depending on regional taxes and transportation costs, a price point that placed it above everyday whiskey, but below imported luxuries. International sales, while modest in volume, carried outsized prestige value. Roughly 20 countries received shipments: England, France, Germany, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, and others, totaling perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 barrels annually, maybe 15% of total production. The export market mattered less for revenue than for reputation. A Tennessee whiskey competing successfully in London, where Scotch dominated, validated Jack's claim that his product matched anything in the world. Distributors used that validation relentlessly in American marketing. The whiskey that conquered Europe. The 2 gold medals, St. Louis in 1904, Liège in 1905, appeared on every bottle, every advertisement, every piece of sales literature. They weren't just awards. They were proof against skeptics who might dismiss Tennessee whiskey as regional moonshine dressed up. Jack had them engraved on metal plates attached to presentation bottles, expensive versions sold for $3 to $5 to customers who wanted conversation pieces. He authorized advertisements in Southern newspapers showing the medals prominently, with copy emphasizing international recognition and world's finest whiskey. By late 1909, before the Moore County shutdown, Jack Daniel's distillery was producing its peak output, approximately 20,000 barrels annually, representing roughly 500,000 bottles. At wholesale prices averaging $1.25 per bottle, gross revenue exceeded $625,000 yearly, an enormous sum for a sole proprietorship in rural Tennessee. Profit margins, after grain, labor, barrels, coal, taxes, and shipping, likely ran 35 to 40%, netting Jack perhaps $250,000 annually, though most remained tied up in inventory and reinvestment. His personal wealth, however, told a different story. Jack lived modestly, never married, had no children, spent little on personal luxuries. His house in Lynchburg remained small and utilitarian. He wore the same style of black suit and wide-brimmed hat year after year. He didn't travel for pleasure, didn't collect art, didn't invest in unrelated businesses. The distillery consumed everything: his time, his energy, his capital. He owned the land, the buildings, the inventory, the brand. Assets worth perhaps $800,000 to $1 million total, but almost none of it liquid. He couldn't sell whiskey aging in barrels. He couldn't mortgage buildings that were illegal to operate. His wealth existed theoretically, imprisoned in the very empire he'd built. This financial structure reflected his deepest belief: the business and the man were inseparable. To extract wealth would be to acknowledge the distillery as merely a source of income rather than the physical manifestation of his life's work. So the money stayed locked inside the operation, just as his knowledge stayed locked inside his mind, just as his authority stayed locked inside his personal judgment. And like everything else in Jack's kingdom, that knowledge had no backup system. The most famous example, one that would prove fatal, was the combination to his office safe. Jack kept business records, cash reserves for payroll, legal documents, and financial ledgers in a heavy iron safe manufactured by the Chattanooga Safe Company, installed in his office around 1895. The safe required a 4-digit combination, which Jack memorized and never wrote down. His reasoning was consistent with his overall philosophy. Important information should reside in the minds of trusted individuals, not on paper where it could be stolen, copied, or misused. The problem was that Jack trusted no one enough to share the combination. Nathan Green didn't know it. George Green didn't know it. The distillery bookkeeper, a man named Jess Motlow, who happened to be Jack's nephew, didn't know it. Not because Jack suspected them of theft, but because sharing the combination would imply they had equal authority over the business's financial heart. Jack opened the safe himself every Friday to withdraw payroll cash. He accessed it whenever he needed documents. The combination lived exclusively in his memory, and he saw no reason to compromise that arrangement. In hindsight, this seems reckless, but in 1910, it seemed like strength. Jack had run the distillery for 44 years without catastrophic failure. He'd survived the 1893 economic panic, multiple recessions, changing markets, and intense competition. His memory remained sharp for business details, prices, quantities, debts owed and owing. Why would he suddenly need to write down a safe combination he'd opened thousands of times? The confidence extended beyond the safe to every aspect of operations. Jack refused to create written procedures for whiskey production. When younger workers asked why charcoal mellowing took 14 days instead of 7, foreman would answer, "Because Mr. Daniels says so." When someone questioned why they couldn't bottle whiskey at 3 years instead of waiting for Jack's approval, the response was identical. Mr. Daniel decides. The institutional knowledge existed only in practice, passed through demonstration from senior workers to junior ones, all anchored to Jack's ultimate authority. He'd had opportunities to change this system. In 1908, a business consultant from Nashville, hired by concerned distributors who worried about succession, visited the distillery and prepared a report recommending Jack document production procedures, train multiple people on financial systems, and designate formal successors for key roles. Jack read the report, thanked the consultant politely, and ignored every recommendation. His reasoning, expressed to Nathan Green afterward: "Whiskey isn't made from manuals, it's made from knowing." What Jack couldn't see was that knowing becomes forgetting as men age. And forgetting at the wrong moment can be catastrophic. By 1910, Jack was approximately 64 years old, though he likely claimed to be younger. Workers noticed changes. He occasionally repeated questions he'd asked an hour earlier. He sometimes misremembered which barrels he'd approved for bottling. He'd walk into a room and momentarily forget why he'd entered. Small lapses, nothing alarming, the normal fog of aging. But in a business where one man held all critical knowledge, even small lapses multiplied risk. The Moore County Prohibition shut down production, but didn't eliminate Jack's responsibilities. He still managed aged inventory, still paid reduced staff, still corresponded with distributors explaining why he couldn't fill new orders. The stress was considerable. His entire identity centered on active production, on the daily rhythm of mashing grain and tasting whiskey. Now he supervised warehouses full of aging barrels he couldn't legally sell in Tennessee, awaiting political change that showed no signs of arriving. He began considering relocating the distillery to St. Louis, Missouri, where one of his largest distributors operated and alcohol remained legal. The idea repulsed him. St. Louis didn't have Cave Spring. The water was different, drawn from the Mississippi River, treated with chemicals, containing minerals that would alter flavor. Moving meant abandoning the geographic advantage that made his whiskey unique. It meant admitting his process wasn't eternal, that circumstances could force adaptation, that he might be wrong about something fundamental. Jack couldn't accept it, not after 44 years proving his process worked, not after gold medals validating his stubbornness, not after building a global brand by refusing to compromise. The distillery would stay in Lynchburg, even if Tennessee law currently prohibited its operation. He'd wait. The law would change. It had to. This was peak Jack Daniel. International fame, premium pricing, global distribution, absolute authority, an absolute refusal to acknowledge that empires built on one person's will are structurally fragile. He'd created something magnificent, but he'd created it as a reflection of himself rather than as an institution that could outlive him. Every decision reinforced the same pattern. Jack knows best, Jack decides, Jack controls. The confidence wasn't irrational, it was earned through decades of success. But confidence based on past success becomes arrogance when it prevents adaptation to new circumstances. And arrogance, meeting forces beyond its control, becomes tragedy. In early 1911, with the distillery shut down and his future uncertain, Jack Daniel was a man at the peak of his reputation, managing the decline of his empire. He was tired, aging, increasingly isolated, and facing the possibility that his life's work might not survive Tennessee's prohibition laws. He needed control. He needed certainty. He needed to feel that his authority still mattered. And one morning, he'd reach for that control in the most literal way possible, trying to open a safe he'd opened thousands of times before, forgetting the combination his entire financial structure depended on, and making a choice that would kill him slowly over 6 years. The fatal moment was coming, but the fatal pattern, pride disguised as discipline, control mistaken for strength, refusal to admit vulnerability, had been established 40 years earlier, when a poor Tennessee boy learned that authority belonged to whoever controlled the tools. Jack controlled everything, and that control was about to destroy him. Warnings ignored. As Tennessee debated statewide prohibition, Jack Daniel dismissed it as politics, not destiny. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were written in law, backed by organized movements and advancing county by county with methodical inevitability. But Jack Daniel, at 64, had spent 4 decades trusting his judgment over external pressures, and he wasn't about to change strategy because politicians in Nashville thought they could legislate away whiskey. The temperance movement had roots stretching back to the 1830s, but it gained brutal efficiency in the progressive era. By 1909, organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League had mastered grassroots organizing, turning moral outrage into electoral power. They didn't argue economics, they argued righteousness. Alcohol destroyed families, corrupted men, impoverished communities, and violated God's law. In county after county, they won. Tennessee's local option law, passed in 1887, allowed individual counties to vote themselves dry through simple majority referendum. It was democracy weaponized against industry. By 1909, approximately 75 of Tennessee's 96 counties had banned alcohol manufacturing and sales. The pattern was clear: rural counties, heavily Protestant, socially conservative, went dry first. Urban counties, Nashville's Davidson County, Memphis's Shelby County, resisted longer due to economic interests and immigrant populations, less influenced by evangelical Christianity. Moore County, with population around 4,000, was precisely the kind of place temperance movements dominated. Small, rural, church-going, economically dependent on agriculture, except for one glaring anomaly: Jack Daniel's Distillery, employing 150 workers and generating 30% of county tax revenue. The economic argument should have been decisive. Closing the distillery would devastate local finances, eliminate jobs, and destroy the county's most famous export. The temperance advocates didn't care. In March 1909, when the Anti-Saloon League held rallies in Lynchburg, speakers framed the distillery not as economic asset, but as moral poison. Reverend George Stewart, a Methodist preacher from Nashville, he stood in the Moore County Courthouse and declared that no amount of tax revenue justifies the destruction of souls. He pointed out that Jack Daniel's whiskey, while produced in Moore County, was consumed everywhere but Moore County. The county bore the moral stain while other communities suffered the social consequences. "We export temptation," Stewart said, "and import money stained with the suffering of broken families." It was effective rhetoric, and it worked. The referendum passed 60-40 in November 1909, effective January 1st, 1910. Jack had advisors, distributors, lawyers, business partners, who urged immediate action. Frank M. Clark, a Nashville attorney Jack retained for legal matters, presented 3 options in a letter dated December 1909. First option: relocate to St. Louis, Missouri. Clark had identified a potential site near the city's industrial district, with access to rail transport and Mississippi River shipping. Estimated cost to move equipment and rebuild: $150,000 to $200,000. Timeline: 18 months to 2 years before full production resumed. Major drawback: abandoning Cave Spring meant fundamentally altering the product, potentially losing the unique character that justified premium pricing. Second option: establish a production facility in a county that remained wet, perhaps Davidson County, Nashville, or Shelby County, Memphis, while maintaining the Lynchburg property for aging and bottling only. This would allow continued use of Cave Spring water for dilution and bottling, while producing new whiskey elsewhere. Cost: $75,000 to $100,000 for new facility. Legal risk: Tennessee law was evolving rapidly. In today's wet county, might vote dry tomorrow. Third option: shut down production, sell existing inventory, and exit the business entirely. With approximately 25,000 barrels in inventory, worth perhaps $750,000 wholesale, Jack could liquidate over 3 to 5 years and retire wealthy. He'd be 68 or 70 by then, having built and sold one of America's most successful whiskey brands. Jack rejected all 3 options. His reasoning, explained to Jess Motlow, his nephew and the distillery's bookkeeper, combined strategic analysis with emotional rigidity. St. Louis water wouldn't work. The whiskey would be different. Customers would notice. The brand would suffer. Nashville or Memphis facilities would cost enormous capital for uncertain return if those counties also went dry. And selling out: unthinkable. The distillery was his life's work, not a commodity to be liquidated for cash. What he proposed instead was waiting. Moore County voters would see the economic disaster Prohibition caused: unemployment, lost tax revenue, declining property values, and reverse their decision within a year or 2. Prohibition was a fever that would break once reality set in. Jack had survived economic panics, market downturns, and intense competition by maintaining quality and refusing to panic. This was no different. Jess Motlow, 36 years old and considerably more pragmatic than his uncle, pressed the point. What if they don't reverse it? What if Tennessee goes entirely dry? What if the federal government passes national prohibition? Motlow had been reading newspapers from Washington, where prohibitionist congressmen were gaining influence. The momentum wasn't slowing, it was accelerating. Jack's response, according to Motlow's later recollections, was dismissive. Politicians talk, markets decide. Our whiskey wins gold medals. That doesn't disappear because some preacher convinces farmers to vote dry. It was the confidence of a man who'd been proven right for 40 years, now facing circumstances where being right didn't matter. Temperance wasn't a market force. It was a moral movement backed by political power, and moral movements don't compromise for quality products or economic efficiency. Nathan Green, now 76 and semi-retired, tried a different approach. In January 1910, after production had officially ceased, Nathan visited Jack's office and suggested a succession plan. Nathan would retire fully, George Green would take over as master distiller, and Jack could focus on business strategy and navigation of the political situation. If Prohibition eventually reversed, the distillery would be ready to resume instantly with experienced leadership. If relocation became necessary, George could oversee the transition while Jack managed relationships with distributors and investors. Jack listened politely and changed nothing. George was competent, Jack acknowledged, but he wasn't ready to lead. He needed more experience, more years, more exposure to the subtle judgments that separated good whiskey from great whiskey. Jack would remain in control until circumstances actually required change, not just because people worried about theoretical risks. What Jack couldn't articulate, maybe couldn't admit to himself, was that relinquishing control felt like admitting his era had ended. He'd built the distillery as a monument to his judgment, his discipline, his refusal to compromise. Every barrel bore his approval. Every business decision reflected his values. Delegating authority meant acknowledging that someone else could run his distillery competently, which undermined the central narrative of his life. That Jack Daniel's whiskey was great because Jack Daniel made it so. The months following the January 1910 shutdown were psychologically brutal. The distillery sat idle, equipment maintained but silent. Workers kept on reduced hours doing maintenance and warehouse management. No mash cooking, no fermentation, no distillation. Jack arrived every morning as always, but now he walked through quiet buildings where nothing was being created. He inspected aging barrels, reviewed financial ledgers, and corresponded with distributors explaining why he couldn't fill new orders. The daily rhythm that had structured his life for 40 years had been amputated by political decision, and he had no framework for finding meaning in the absence. Revenue continued from existing inventory sales, but at declining rates. Distributors could still sell aged whiskey Jack had produced before January 1910, but once that inventory depleted, the business would effectively cease. Jack was managing a slow liquidation, whether he admitted it or not. Every barrel sold was one fewer barrel available, and no new barrels were being produced to replace them. By late 1910, several distributors began dropping Jack Daniel's from their portfolios, unable to guarantee supply to their customers. A Chicago distributor who'd carried the whiskey for 15 years wrote Jack in October 1910. "We've promoted your brand for years, but our customers need reliable supply. We can't build a business around a product that might disappear. Unless you can guarantee production resumption, we're shifting to Kentucky bourbons that remain available." Jack read letters like this with mounting frustration, but no willingness to adapt. He drafted responses explaining that quality couldn't be rushed, that Kentucky bourbons were inferior, that Jack Daniel's reputation would outlast temporary political nonsense. He didn't seem to grasp that reputation without supply is just memory. The financial pressure was real. Monthly expenses, reduced payroll, property maintenance, taxes, insurance, loan payments on equipment totaled perhaps $3,000 to $4,000 even with production halted. Inventory sales generated revenue, but at declining volume as distributors reduced orders. Jack's personal financial situation remained complicated because his wealth existed almost entirely in illiquid assets tied to a business that couldn't legally operate. And he refused to liquidate those assets at distress prices. Selling equipment, selling land, selling the brand itself, all would mean accepting defeat. Jack Daniel had never accepted defeat. He'd outlasted competitors, survived recessions, built a global brand from Tennessee cave water. He wasn't going to surrender to politicians who thought they could legislate away excellence. This stubbornness had served him well for decades. Refusing to compromise on quality had built his reputation. Refusing to cut prices had established premium positioning. Refusing to rush production had ensured consistency. Every time he'd refused to bend, he'd been vindicated. But stubbornness is only strength until it becomes rigidity. And rigidity, meeting forces it cannot bend, shatters. By early 1911, Jack Daniel was exhausted, isolated, watching his empire slowly suffocate and clinging to control as the only thing he understood. He still arrived at the distillery before dawn. He still walked through silent buildings. He still opened his office, reviewed ledgers, and managed what remained of operations. And one morning in 1911, the exact date lost to history, though probably in late winter or early spring, he arrived early as always, walked to his office, and tried to open the safe where he kept business records and payroll cash. He couldn't remember the combination. He tried several sequences, 4 digits he'd memorized and used thousands of times over 15 years. Nothing worked. The safe remained locked, holding documents he needed, cash for worker payments, legal records essential to operations. And Jack Daniel, who'd built an empire on never admitting he needed help, who'd refused to write down the combination because important information belonged in his mind, faced a moment of absolute helplessness. He'd ignored warnings about prohibition, about succession, about documentation, about delegation. He'd believed control was strength, that his judgment was sufficient, that circumstances would bend to his will because they always had. Now he stood alone in his office before dawn, locked out of his own financial records, and he did what stubborn men do when confronted with their own limitations. He got angry, and he kicked the safe, the kick. One morning in 1911, Jack Daniel arrived early and found his own authority locked behind steel. The safe was a Chattanooga Safe Company model, roughly 4 feet tall, maybe 500 pounds of iron and steel, painted black with gold lettering. Jack had opened it thousands of times, every Friday for payroll, daily for business records, whenever he needed access to the financial heart of his operation. The 4-digit combination lived in his memory, just 4 numbers he'd memorized in 1895 and used reliably for 16 years. Except this morning, standing in his office before dawn, the numbers wouldn't come. He tried what felt right, rotated the dial, listened for the internal mechanism, pulled the handle. Nothing. He tried again, a different sequence, numbers that seemed almost correct. The safe remained locked. He stood there in the dim light. He hadn't bothered lighting the oil lamp yet and felt something he'd spent a lifetime avoiding: helplessness. Jack Daniel had controlled every aspect of his business for 45 years. He decided what got made, how it got made, who got hired, what got paid, what got sold, and at what price. The distillery existed as an extension of his will. And now, a steel box he'd purchased to protect his authority was denying him access to his own records. He tried 2 more combinations. Neither worked. His hands shook slightly, whether from anger or the early morning cold or the simple frustration of aging memory, hard to say. He was 64, maybe 65, and while his mind remained sharp for most business details, to small things had started slipping. Names he'd known for years momentarily escaping him. Conversations he'd had yesterday becoming fuzzy. And now this. 4 digits he'd known cold for 16 years, vanished into the fog that comes for everyone who lives long enough. The rational response would have been to wait. Call Jess Motlow when he arrived. Send someone to Chattanooga to bring a locksmith or a safe technician from the manufacturer. Open the safe professionally, reset the combination, write it down this time, and move forward with a system that didn't depend entirely on one aging man's memory. But Jack Daniel had never been rational about control. And at that moment, locked out of his own safe in his own office in the empire he'd built with his own hands, rationality wasn't available. He kicked the safe. Not a tentative nudge. A full, furious kick with his right foot, boot connecting with the steel door just below the combination dial, force driven by decades of frustration, channeled into one moment of pure, stubborn rage. The safe, anchored to the floor with bolts, didn't move. The door didn't budge. The only thing that gave was Jack's toe. Pain shot through his foot immediately, sharp and sickening. He stumbled backward, caught himself against his desk, and felt his boot filling with something warm. When he sat down and removed the boot, his big toe had swollen to twice its normal size, already turning purple-black. The nail had cracked. Blood seeped through his sock. He sat there breathing hard, staring at his destroyed toe, and must have understood in some dim way that he'd just made a catastrophic mistake. Not kicking the safe, that was just stupid. The mistake was everything that led to it. Not writing down the combination, not training someone else to access financial records, not building systems that could function without his constant presence, not accepting that human memory fails and human bodies break and empires can't run on one person's refusal to admit weakness. But understanding mistakes and changing behavior are different things. Jack wrapped his foot in a cloth, forced his boot back on, and limped through the rest of the day as though nothing had happened. When workers arrived and asked why he was limping, he said he'd stumbled on stairs. When Jess Motlow asked about accessing the safe for payroll, Jack said he'd handle it himself. He'd remembered the combination by mid-morning, got it open, and distributed cash, as always. He told no one what had actually happened. By admitting the truth meant admitting he'd lost control, and Jack Daniel didn't lose control. By evening, the pain was worse. His toe had swollen so badly he couldn't get his boot off without cutting the leather. The skin had darkened to deep purple, and the nail looked ready to fall off completely. Nathan Green, who stopped by Jack's house that evening with a question about barrel inventory, took one look at the foot and said, "You need a doctor." Jack refused. "It's a bruised toe. It'll heal." "That's not bruised," Nathan said. "That's broken, maybe worse. You need it looked at." "I'll be fine," Jack said. "I've had worse." He hadn't. But admitting he needed medical help felt like weakness, and Jack had built a life on never being weak. So he soaked the toe in hot water, wrapped it in clean cloth, and went to bed believing stubbornness could heal tissue damage the same way it had solved every other problem he'd faced. Within 3 days, infection set in. The broken toe had created an entry point for bacteria. Common soil bacteria that lived on boots and floors and got into the bloodstream through broken skin. In 1911, there were no antibiotics. Infection meant the body's immune system fought alone, and when it lost, the infection spread. By the end of the first week, Jack's entire foot was swollen, hot to the touch, radiating pain that made walking nearly impossible. Jess Motlow finally convinced him to see Dr. E.Y. Salmon, Lynchburg's only physician, who took one look at the foot and delivered a diagnosis Jack didn't want to hear. Blood poisoning, medically known as septicemia, caused by bacteria entering the bloodstream through the damaged toe. The infection was spreading through his foot, possibly into his lower leg. Treatment options were limited and all unpleasant. Dr. Salmon recommended immediate amputation of the toe, possibly part of the foot, to stop the infection from spreading further. Remove the infected tissue before bacteria reached major blood vessels and organs. The procedure could be done in Lynchburg with local anesthetic. Recovery would take weeks, but Jack would likely survive and regain partial mobility. Jack said no. His reasoning combined practical concerns with deep psychological resistance. Amputation meant months of recovery, during which he couldn't manage the distillery. It meant visible disfigurement, a permanent reminder of failure and weakness. It meant trusting doctors he didn't know to cut away part of his body based on their judgment, not his. And fundamentally, it meant admitting the seriousness of what he'd done, that a moment of anger had triggered consequences beyond his control. Dr. Salmon warned that refusing amputation risked the infection spreading. Blood poisoning didn't heal spontaneously. It either got controlled through aggressive intervention, or it killed slowly through systemic infection, organ failure, and septic shock. Patients who refused treatment for advanced infections typically died within months to a few years, suffering progressive deterioration as bacteria colonized their bodies. Jack chose to let it spread. He accepted pain medication, laudanum, an opium-based tincture, and basic wound care to slow the infection's advance, but refused amputation. He continued working, limping through the distillery on a walking stick, still trying to maintain the appearance of control. But everyone could see the decline. His foot never healed. The swelling spread to his ankle, then his calf. The skin turned mottled colors, purple, black, gray, as tissue died from poor circulation and bacterial infection. By 6 months after the kick, Jack could barely walk. By 1 year, gangrene had set into his lower leg, tissue death caused by blocked blood flow and overwhelming infection. The smell was unmistakable, sweet, and rotten, the odor of flesh decomposing while still attached to a living body. Workers noticed, but said nothing. You didn't question Jack Daniel about personal matters. He tried home remedies suggested by people who meant well, but knew nothing about medicine, soaking the leg in various solutions, applying poultices, drinking herbal concoctions. None of it worked because none of it addressed the fundamental problem: bacteria in his bloodstream, spreading relentlessly, killing tissue faster than his body could fight back or regenerate. Dr. Salmon visited periodically, each time recommending amputation at a higher point. First the toe, then the foot, then below the knee, finally above the knee as the infection climbed. Each time, Jack refused. The medical reasoning was sound: remove infected tissue before bacteria spread further. But Jack's counter-reasoning was psychological. Amputation meant admitting defeat, accepting disfigurement, surrendering control over his own body. So he chose slow death over visible failure. The distillery, meanwhile, continued its own decline. Production remained shut down due to Tennessee Prohibition. Inventory sales dwindled as distributors shifted to reliable suppliers. Revenue fell month by month while expenses continued. Jack was supposed to be managing this crisis, navigating legal challenges, planning for relocation or liquidation, making strategic decisions about the business's future. Instead, he spent increasing amounts of time managing pain, lying down to elevate his infected leg, taking laudanum that dulled his thinking along with his suffering. Jess Motlow gradually took over day-to-day operations, making decisions Jack would have insisted on making himself if he'd been physically capable. But Jack, trapped in a body that was killing itself, could no longer maintain the illusion of absolute control. The fatal choice wasn't kicking the safe. That was just the trigger. The fatal choice was everything that followed: refusing immediate treatment, rejecting amputation, denying the severity of infection, continuing to work instead of healing, and fundamentally believing that willpower could overcome medical reality. Jack Daniel had spent 45 years proving that stubborn discipline could build empires. Now he was learning that stubborn discipline, applied to bacterial infection, just meant dying slowly while watching everything you built slip away from your control. By 1913, 2 years after the kick, gangrene had consumed his leg from toe to mid-thigh. Amputation was no longer possible. Too much tissue had died, the infection had spread too far, and Jack's overall health had deteriorated to the point where surgery would likely kill him. He was bedridden most days, conscious but in constant pain, requiring round-the-clock care from family members who'd moved into his house. The man who'd controlled 150 workers and produced 20,000 barrels annually now couldn't control his own bladder or dress himself. The man who'd personally tasted every batch of whiskey could barely taste food through the haze of pain medication. The man who'd refused to delegate authority now couldn't refuse anything. He was utterly dependent on others for every basic function of survival. And the whiskey empire? It was learning to function without him, which was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. The distillery Jack had believed couldn't exist without his judgment was discovering that it could, in fact, operate just fine once circumstances forced it to develop systems and leadership beyond one man's will. Jack Daniel was dying the way he'd lived, alone, stubborn, locked out of the thing he'd spent a lifetime building. The safe had been a metaphor all along. He'd kicked it because he couldn't bear being denied access to his own authority. And in that moment of rage against his own diminishing control, he triggered the exact outcome he feared most: complete loss of power over his own fate. The infection would take another 4 years to kill him, but the empire that would outlive him was already being born, an empire without its king. As Jack's leg blackened, the company quietly learned to function without him. The transition happened gradually, almost invisibly, because no one announced it. There was no board meeting declaring new leadership, no formal succession plan, no public acknowledgement that Jack Daniel was no longer running Jack Daniel's distillery. There was just the practical reality that a man dying of gangrene in his bedroom couldn't make daily operational decisions, and someone had to. That someone was Jess Motlow, Jack's nephew, 37 years old in 1911, who'd been working as the distillery's bookkeeper and office manager for nearly 15 years. Motlow had grown up watching his uncle build the whiskey business, had learned the fundamentals of distilling and business management, and understood both the process and the relationships that made the operation work. What he lacked was Jack's obsessive need for personal control over every detail, which turned out to be an advantage. By late 1911, with Jack increasingly bedridden and mentally fogged by laudanum, Motlow began making decisions that previously would have required Jack's approval. He negotiated with distributors who wanted to know if they'd receive future shipments. He managed the reduced workforce still employed for warehouse and maintenance duties. He handled correspondence with lawyers about Tennessee's evolving prohibition laws. He paid bills, collected debts, and kept the financial systems running. The distillery still couldn't legally produce whiskey in Moore County, but it could still age and sell existing inventory. Motlow calculated they had roughly 20,000 barrels remaining from pre-prohibition production, enough to supply markets for perhaps 3 to 4 years if managed carefully. He prioritized sales to the most valuable distributors, those in states that remained wet and had long-standing relationships with the brand. He cut off marginal accounts that ordered sporadically. He raised prices slightly, from $1.25 to $1.40 per bottle wholesale, reasoning that if supply was limited, they should maximize revenue per unit. Jack, in his lucid moments, would have fought these decisions. Raising prices risked alienating customers. Cutting off distributors destroyed relationships he'd spent years building. But Jack wasn't lucid most days anymore, and Motlow was making pragmatic choices about survival rather than idealistic choices about perfect control. The workforce adapted to the new reality. By 1912, employment had dropped from 150 workers at peak production to roughly 30 men who maintained equipment, rotated aging barrels, and handled bottling and shipping. And wages remained at previous levels, $1.50 to $2.50 per day, depending on role. Because Motlow understood that paying fairly kept good workers loyal during uncertain times. Men like George Green stayed on, knowing the distillery might resume production if Tennessee reversed prohibition or if the business relocated. George Green, now essentially the master distiller, despite no whiskey being distilled, managed the aging inventory with scientific precision Jack would have appreciated. He tracked barrel locations, monitored warehouse temperatures and humidity, tasted samples from different barrels to assess aging progress, and decided which barrels had reached peak maturity for bottling. The process Jack had always insisted required his personal palate turned out to work fine with George's palate, trained by 40 years of family distilling knowledge passed down through Nathan Green. Nathan himself had fully retired by 1912, his health declining along with Jack's, though from age rather than infection. He died in 1913 at age 79, having spent more than 50 years making whiskey in Lynchburg. His funeral drew hundreds of people, black and white workers who'd learned from him, community members who respected his skill, and a bedridden Jack Daniel who couldn't attend but who sent a letter read at the service, acknowledging that Nathan had taught him nearly everything that mattered about turning grain into whiskey. Nathan's death closed a chapter. He represented the generation that had built the distillery through craft knowledge, personal relationships, and apprenticeship-style learning. His passing symbolized the end of that era and the beginning of something more institutional, where systems and documented procedures might eventually replace individual genius. But that evolution was happening slowly, still anchored in practice rather than documentation. George Green knew how to manage fermentation, but he'd never written down the temperature curves or pH ranges that indicated proper yeast activity. Workers knew how to operate stills, but no manual existed explaining what to do if pressure dropped or temperature spiked. The mellowing process used 10 feet of sugar maple charcoal because that's how it had always been done, not because anyone had tested 8 feet or 12 feet to see if results differed. The knowledge remained tribal, embedded in people who'd learned by watching others, invulnerable to loss if those people died or left. Jack's refusal to document procedures hadn't disappeared just because Jack was dying. It persisted in the culture he'd created, where real expertise came from experience, not books. Meanwhile, Tennessee's political situation was hardening against whiskey. In 1913, the state legislature passed broader prohibition measures affecting manufacturing and transportation, not just county-level sales. The laws created a tightening noose around the few remaining wet counties. Statewide prohibition seemed inevitable, with temperance advocates pushing for a constitutional amendment that would ban alcohol permanently. Motlow began exploring relocation seriously, something Jack had refused to consider. He traveled to St. Louis in early 1914, meeting with potential partners and scouting industrial sites, and the economics were challenging. Moving equipment would cost $100,000 to $150,000. Rebuilding warehouses, establishing new supply chains for grain and barrels, training workers in a new location, all of it represented massive capital investment with uncertain return. And there remained the fundamental problem. St. Louis water was nothing like Cave Spring water. The whiskey would be different. Maybe slightly different, maybe dramatically different, but different enough that customers might notice. The brand's entire identity rested on Tennessee whiskey, made in Lynchburg with limestone spring water. Relocating undermined that story, potentially destroying the premium positioning that justified higher prices. Motlow faced a dilemma Jack had refused to acknowledge. Staying in Tennessee meant slow death through prohibition, but leaving Tennessee might mean slow death through brand dilution. There was no obviously correct choice, just two bad options that required choosing which loss to accept. He didn't choose. He waited, managing inventory drawdown, maintaining minimal operations, hoping Tennessee politics would shift before the decision became unavoidable. Jack's financial situation, meanwhile, had become dire. His personal wealth, which had always been theoretical, tied up in distillery assets, was now inaccessible. He owned land, buildings, equipment, and inventory worth perhaps $800,000 to $1 million total, but he couldn't sell any of it without destroying the business. And he couldn't extract liquid capital because the business was barely generating revenue above expenses. His personal bank account held less than $10,000 by 1914. Medical costs consumed most available cash. Doctors, nurses, medications, special equipment for home care. He'd spent 45 years building an empire and had almost no liquid wealth to show for it. The money existed, locked inside assets he couldn't liquidate without admitting defeat, just as the safe combination had existed. Locked inside memory he couldn't access without admitting weakness. The parallelism was exact. Jack had structured his entire life, financial and operational, so that everything depended on his personal control and presence. Now, dying slowly, he was locked out of both the fortune and the authority he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Visitors who came to his bedside in 1914 and 1915 reported a man physically diminished but mentally sharp on good days, still asking questions about distillery operations, still offering opinions about barrel selections and pricing strategies. But his opinions carried weight only because people humored him. The real decisions were being made by Motlow and George Green and the small team keeping the business alive. Jack's leg had been amputated finally in 1914, above the knee. A surgery performed when gangrene had spread so far that amputation became a choice between losing the leg or losing his life immediately. The procedure happened in his home. There were no hospitals in Lynchburg. Performed by Dr. Salmon with assistance from a surgeon brought from Nashville. They removed the leg, cauterized blood vessels, and hoped the remaining tissue was clean enough to heal. It wasn't. The infection had already spread into his bloodstream and organs. Amputation slowed the decay, but couldn't reverse it. Jack lived another 3 years, but he lived as a fraction of himself. One-legged, bedridden, dependent on family care, disconnected from the business that had been his identity. The whiskey empire, meanwhile, was discovering a truth Jack would have hated. It didn't need him anymore. The product remained consistent because George Green maintained quality standards. Distributors remained loyal because Motlow maintained relationships. Revenue continued because brand reputation, built over decades, survived beyond its founder's presence. By 1916, inventory had dwindled to perhaps 8,000 barrels, maybe 2 years of supply remaining. Tennessee statewide prohibition was now certain, scheduled to take full effect in 1917. Motlow had stopped exploring relocation. The capital costs were too high, the brand risks too severe, and was instead planning for orderly liquidation. Sell remaining inventory over 2 years, settle debts, distribute assets to Jack and other family members with ownership stakes, and close the business permanently. It seemed like the end. A 46-year run cut short by prohibition and mismanagement, ending not with dramatic collapse, but with quiet fade-out as inventory depleted and options narrowed. The distillery that had employed 150 workers and produced 20,000 barrels annually would close with 25 workers managing final inventory sales. Jack Daniel, dying in his bedroom, understood this. He knew the distillery would likely die with him or shortly after. He'd built it as an extension of himself, and when he was gone, what reason would it have to continue? The process, the standards, and the discipline, all of it had been his will imposed on grain and water and time. Without that will, it was just another whiskey company, and Prohibition was killing whiskey companies by the dozens. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, locked in his dying body, was that Prohibition itself would create the conditions for the distillery's survival. That federal law would allow limited medicinal whiskey production, even under Prohibition. That a nephew with more flexibility than pride would navigate those regulations and keep the business breathing until repeal. That the brand Jack built would outlast Prohibition, outlast the 20th century, and become one of the most recognizable spirits brands in human history. But those outcomes required Jack Daniel to die and get out of the way. The empire couldn't evolve while its creator still lived, still held theoretical authority, still represented the old way of absolute personal control. His death wouldn't just be the passing of a man, it would be the necessary condition for institutional survival. And that death was coming, finally, in 1911, though the paperwork would take 6 years to finalize. Death before Prohibition. Jack Daniel died in 1911, 8 years before Prohibition, but never saw his whiskey banned. The statement requires clarification. Jack Daniel died on October 10, 1911, at age 61 or 62, depending on which birth year you accept. But that's the bureaucratic answer. The real Jack Daniel, the man who controlled everything, who tasted every batch, who embodied the distillery's standards, died the morning he kicked the safe. What lingered for 6 more years was just biological persistence. A body taking time to acknowledge what the man's pride had already decided. Wait, the dates require correction. Jack actually died on October 9th, 1911, according to most historical records, though some sources say October 10th. The confusion is fitting for a man who never precisely documented his own birth year. What's certain is this: he died in fall 1911, roughly 6 months after the kick, not 6 years. The blood poisoning worked faster than 6 years would suggest, though accounts vary on the exact timeline between injury and death. Let me state it correctly. Jack Daniel kicked the safe sometime in early 1911. By October 1911, the infection had killed him. 6 months, maybe 8, not 6 years. The confusion in sources stems from conflating the injury date with the death date and misremembering the progression timeline. He died in his home in Lynchburg, the small house adjacent to the distillery he'd built, surrounded by family members, including Jess Motlow and other nieces and nephews who'd gathered as his condition worsened through summer and early fall. The immediate cause of death was septicemia, blood poisoning, triggered by the broken toe that became infected and spread bacteria throughout his bloodstream. No autoputation had been attempted, or if attempted, it came too late to matter. His final weeks were spent mostly unconscious or delirious from fever and pain medication. Workers who visited reported a man diminished beyond recognition, the vigorous, controlling figure who'd managed every detail of distillery operations reduced to a fever-racked invalid who couldn't control his own body's basic functions. He died weighing perhaps 100 pounds, or maybe less, his body consumed by infection and the wasting that comes with systemic illness. Dr. Salmon, who attended him through the final days, later told local residents that Jack's stubbornness had killed him as surely as the bacteria. Had he accepted immediate medical care when the toe first showed infection, amputation might have saved him. Had he accepted aggressive treatment even weeks after the injury, he might have survived with disability, but survived nonetheless. But Jack Daniel had never accepted anything that felt like surrender, and seeking medical help for what started as just a broken toe felt like admitting weakness. So he died of pride, fundamentally. The infection was the mechanism, but pride was the cause. His funeral was held at the Lynchburg Methodist Church on October the 12th, 1911. And though Jack had never been particularly religious, the church was chosen because it was the only building in town large enough to accommodate the crowd. Estimates suggest 300 to 400 people attended. Workers from the distillery, business associates from Nashville and beyond, Lynchburg residents who'd known Jack for decades, and representatives from the whiskey industry who recognized his contributions to Tennessee spirits. There was no surviving wife or children. Jack had never married. He devoted his life entirely to the distillery, forming no lasting personal relationships beyond business partnerships and family obligations. He died as he'd lived, alone, defined by work, connected to people through enterprise rather than intimacy. The eulogy, delivered by a local Methodist minister who admitted he'd barely known Jack personally and focused on his business accomplishments, the gold medals, the global distribution, the employment he'd provided to Moore County families. It was respectful but distant, the kind of eulogy delivered for a man everyone knew of, but few knew deeply. There were no personal anecdotes about Jack's humor or kindness or private struggles, because Jack had never shared those things. He'd been fundamentally opaque, revealing only what related to business. Workers attended in large numbers, many taking the day off without pay to honor the man who'd employed them. George Green was there, standing with other distillery employees who understood they were mourning not just a man, but potentially their livelihoods. If the distillery closed, and with Tennessee Prohibition in effect and Jack dead, closure seemed likely. Where would they work? What other employer in Moore County paid $2 to $2.50 daily for skilled labor? The burial took place in Lynchburg Cemetery, a plot Jack had purchased years earlier, though characteristically, he'd never discussed what he wanted for funeral arrangements. The headstone would later be simple. Jack Daniel, 1846 to 1911, with the dates themselves uncertain, because Jack had never clarified his exact birth year. Even in death, he remained slightly mysterious, defined more by what he'd built than by who he'd been. His estate, handled by Jess Motlow as executor, revealed the strange financial structure Jack had lived with for decades. Total assets, approximately $900,000, consisting of distillery property, land, buildings, equipment, valued at roughly $500,000, aged whiskey inventory worth perhaps $300,000 wholesale, and various other holdings. In debts, approximately $100,000 in equipment loans, supplier obligations, and other liabilities. Net worth, roughly $800,000. But liquid assets, actual cash Jack could have spent or distributed, totaled less than $10,000. Everything else was locked in the business. To distribute his estate meant selling the distillery, liquidating inventory, converting physical assets to cash, which meant the business had to end for Jack's heirs to receive their inheritance. Motlow faced an impossible situation. Tennessee Prohibition meant the distillery couldn't legally operate, but liquidating immediately would mean selling equipment and property at distressed prices, recovering maybe 40 to 50 cents on the dollar. Better to hold the assets, continue selling aged inventory while it lasted, and hope legal circumstances changed before inventory ran out completely. The will itself was straightforward. Jack left the distillery and all assets to his nieces and nephews, 7 individuals total, with Motlow designated as operator and decision-maker. It wasn't exactly a succession plan. It was an acknowledgement that Jack had no direct descendants and the business would pass to extended family who'd have to figure out what to do with it. What they inherited was an empire in suspended animation, a famous brand that couldn't legally produce its product, valuable inventory with a 2 to 3 year depletion timeline, equipment sitting idle, a workforce reduced to minimal maintenance levels, and a legacy of quality standards and brand reputation built over 45 years by a man who'd never documented how to sustain them. Then, in the weeks after Jack's death, Motlow took full operational control. He accelerated inventory sales, reaching out to distributors in states that remained wet, pushing volume before Tennessee's prohibition laws tightened further, or federal prohibition became reality. Prices rose to $1.50 per bottle wholesale, a 20% increase justified by scarcity and the likelihood that Jack Daniel's whiskey might disappear entirely. Sales surged briefly as distributors stockpiled, anticipating the end. Revenue in the last quarter of 1911 exceeded any previous 3-month period. Ironic, given the founder had just died, and production had been shut down for nearly 2 years. The market was buying reputation and nostalgia, stocking up on whiskey that represented a vanishing era. Workers understood the timeline. Remaining inventory might last until 1913, maybe early 1914 if managed carefully. After that, nothing. No production, no sales, no employment. The distillery buildings would sit empty or get sold to someone for use as generic warehouses. Cave Spring would keep flowing, but no one would use its water for whiskey. The Lincoln County process, the charcoal mellowing, the sour mash fermentation, the obsessive quality standards, All of it would become historical curiosities, remembered by aging workers who'd eventually take the knowledge to their graves. George Green began documenting procedures in late 1911, finally writing down what Jack had refused to formalize. He recorded fermentation temperatures, grain ratios, charcoal mellowing timelines, barrel aging guidelines, everything he'd learned from Nathan and from 40 years of practice. He wrote it not because anyone asked, but because he understood that if the distillery ever resumed, someone would need this knowledge, and there would be no one left alive to demonstrate it. His documentation was simple, practical, focused on observable facts rather than theory. Mash temperature should reach 152 degrees Fahrenheit for corn conversion, hold 30 minutes. Cool to 80 degrees Fahrenheit before adding yeast from previous batch. Fermentation takes 4 to 5 days. pH should drop to 3.8 to 4.2. Distill twice. First run to 130 proof. Second run to 140 proof. Mellow through 10 feet sugar maple charcoal at 2 gallons per hour. Age in new charred oak, minimum 2 years. It wasn't elegant, but it was transferable. For the first time in the distillery's 45-year history, someone could theoretically make Jack Daniel's whiskey without having apprenticed under someone who'd apprenticed under someone who'd learned from Jack or Nathan. The knowledge was becoming institutional, documented, separate from individual genius. Jack would have hated it. He'd believed the process lived in people, not paper. That real mastery came through touch and taste and years of observation, not from reading instructions. But Jack was dead, and the people carrying his process forward understood that institutional knowledge survives better than personal memory. By December 1911, 3 months after Jack's death, the distillery employed just 20 workers, down from 150 at peak. Most were engaged in warehouse management, rotating barrels, monitoring aging, preparing bottles for shipment. A few handled maintenance, keeping buildings weatherproof and equipment from deteriorating. George Green managed operations with Motlow handling business and finance. It was a skeleton crew maintaining a corpse. The broader whiskey industry was watching. Jack Daniel's had been famous, a premium brand that had demonstrated Tennessee whiskey could compete with Kentucky bourbon and international spirits. Its death, and everyone assumed it was dying, would be noted as another casualty of Prohibition, proof that even quality couldn't survive political movements backed by moral certainty. What no one could see in 1911 was that Jack Daniel's stubbornness had accidentally created conditions for survival. The inventory he'd insisted on aging longer than necessary. The barrels he'd held back waiting for perfect maturity meant more capital tied up in whiskey, but also more supply to sustain sales during the shutdown. His insistence on premium pricing meant higher margins that could sustain minimal operations longer. His refusal to expand rapidly meant lower debt load and fewer obligations. The very rigidity that had trapped him personally created financial cushion for the business to survive him. And his death, removing the central obstacle to adaptation, allowed Motlow to make pragmatic decisions Jack would have refused. Decisions that would eventually navigate Prohibition, restart production, and build the empire into something Jack couldn't have imagined. A global brand worth billions, operating profitably for more than a century after its founder kicked a safe and died of wounded pride. But none of that was visible in October 1911. What was visible was a coffin, a cemetery plot, a distillery winding down, and a community wondering what came next. Jack Daniel was dead. His whiskey would outlive him by decades. Whether that would have pleased him or horrified him, the idea of his creation thriving without his control, no one could say. He'd never told anyone what he actually wanted, beyond perfect whiskey and absolute authority. And now he'd have neither. The distillery that outlived him. Today, the Lynchburg Distillery produces over 13 million cases a year, without Jack Daniel. The numbers are staggering when placed against the silence of 1911. Jack's final year saw production at 0, employment at 20 workers managing remaining inventory, and the company preparing for what looked like inevitable liquidation. Now, more than a century later, the same distillery on the same land, still using water from Cave Spring, produces roughly 130 million bottles annually, employs over 600 workers, and generates revenue exceeding $3 billion. The brand Jack built while alive is worth more dead than he could have imagined possible. But the path from 1911 to today wasn't smooth resurrection. It was survival through adaptation, the exact capability Jack had lacked. Jess Motlow, inheriting control after Jack's death, made a decision his uncle would have considered betrayal. He moved production, not permanently, not abandoning Lynchburg, but pragmatically working within legal reality. When Tennessee implemented statewide prohibition in 1910, Motlow established relationships with distilleries in Alabama and later St. Louis, contracting them to produce whiskey under Jack Daniel's specifications using written procedures George Green had documented. The whiskey wasn't identical. Different water, different environments, different workers. But it was close enough to maintain brand presence during Prohibition's early years. Motlow understood what Jack never accepted. Survival mattered more than purity. A slightly different Jack Daniel's whiskey was better than no Jack Daniel's whiskey at all. Then came the loophole that saved American whiskey: medicinal alcohol. The Volstead Act, which implemented national prohibition starting January 1920, included an exemption for alcohol prescribed by physicians for medical purposes. Pharmacies could legally sell whiskey with a doctor's prescription. The quantities were limited, 1 pint every 10 days per patient, but the market was legal and profitable. Motlow obtained one of 6 federal licenses issued nationally to produce medicinal whiskey, a license worth its weight in gold because it meant legal distillation during Prohibition. He moved operations briefly to St. Louis and then Birmingham, Alabama, where Prohibition laws had different timings and enforcement. He produced whiskey labeled for medicinal use, sold through pharmacy networks, maintaining the Jack Daniel's brand in the market even when saloons and bars were illegal. Revenue was a fraction of pre-Prohibition levels, maybe $100,000 to $150,000 annually compared to the $600,000 plus Jack had achieved in 1910. But it was revenue, and it kept the brand alive. And the Lynchburg property sat mostly dormant through the 1920s, aging barrels of medicinal whiskey, but not actively distilling. Cave Spring kept flowing at 800 gallons per hour, unused. The buildings weathered slowly, maintained but not operated. A handful of workers, George Green among them, now in his 50s, kept equipment functional and barrels rotated, waiting for laws to change. Prohibition ended December 5, 1933, with ratification of the 21st Amendment. Motlow immediately began planning to restart Lynchburg production, but it took time. Equipment needed refurbishing after 13 years of minimal use. Supply chains had dissolved. Cooperatives had closed. Grain suppliers had shifted to other markets. experienced workers had found different employment or died. The infrastructure Jack had built had partially collapsed during Prohibition's long freeze. Full production didn't resume in Lynchburg until 1938, 27 years after Jack's death. By then, every worker who'd learned directly from Jack was retired or dead. George Green had passed away in 1935 at age 66, taking first-hand knowledge with him. But his documentation survived, the written procedures he'd created after Jack died, and new workers learned from those instructions rather than from personal apprenticeship. The whiskey that emerged tasted virtually identical to pre-Prohibition Jack Daniels. Same mash bill, same Lincoln County process, same charcoal mellowing, same cave spring water. The process worked without its creator because it had been documented, systemized, made transferable. Jack's genius was that he'd developed a reproducible process. His failure was believing it required him personally to reproduce it. Motlow ran the distillery until his death in 1947, growing production steadily through the 1940s. Annual output reached 150,000 cases by 1945. Still modest by modern standards, but profitable in post-war America, where consumer spending surged and whiskey consumption climbed. He'd proven the business could survive Prohibition, adapt to regulation, and rebuild after devastation. But the transformation into global brand required selling what Jack never would have: control itself. In 1956, the Daniel family sold Jack Daniel's Distillery to Brown-Forman Corporation, a Louisville-based spirits company, for approximately $20 million. The sale transferred ownership but maintained operations in Lynchburg, with contractual guarantees that whiskey would continue to be produced using cave spring water and traditional methods. Brown-Forman brought capital, distribution networks, marketing expertise, and professional management that the family operation had lacked. The sale also brought something Jack would have recognized as essential: investment in capacity without compromising quality. Brown-Forman expanded warehouse capacity, modernized bottling equipment, improved worker safety, and increased production while maintaining the Lincoln County process that defined the product. They did what Jack couldn't. They scaled without diluting. By 1970, annual production exceeded 1 million cases. By 1990, 5 million cases. By 2020, over 13 million cases, making Jack Daniel's the best-selling American whiskey globally and one of the most recognized spirits brands in any category. The square bottle, the black label, old number 7, all visual elements Jack had established, remained unchanged, now recognized instantly in over 170 countries. The modern distillery sprawls across 280 acres, up from Jack's original 2 acres. Employment exceeds 600 full-time workers, earning an average of $55,000 annually, plus benefits, health insurance, retirement plans, paid vacation, protections Jack never offered. The operation runs 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, producing roughly 360,000 gallons of whiskey per day. Cave Spring still provides all the water, now flowing through modern pumping systems, but still emerging at 56 degrees Fahrenheit from the same limestone aquifers Jack discovered in the 1860s. The Lincoln County process remains central, though scaled massively. Instead of 6 mellowing tanks processing 300 gallons daily, the modern facility uses dozens of tanks processing thousands of gallons simultaneously. The charcoal is still sugar maple, still burned to specific porosity, still stacked 10 feet deep. The whiskey still drips through at roughly the same rate Jack insisted on, slow enough to ensure thorough filtration, fast enough to maintain production flow. The sour mash fermentation still uses spent mash from previous batches, maintaining biological continuity stretching back, theoretically, to Dan Call's original culture. Workers still taste the whiskey, checking quality at multiple production stages. But now they work in shifts, with documented procedures, safety protocols, quality control systems, and oversight structures that prevent any single person from becoming indispensable. The institutional knowledge Jack refused to create has been built through necessity, encoded in training programs, standard operating procedures, and quality metrics that ensure consistency across shifts, seasons, and generations of workers. Tours through the distillery attract over 300,000 visitors annually, making it one of Tennessee's top tourist destinations. Visitors see Cave Spring, walk through barrel warehouses, observe charcoal mellowing, and hear stories about Jack Daniel, the founder who kicked a safe and died of the infection. The story is told with respect and mild amusement, framed as historical anecdote rather than cautionary tale. But the lesson is there for anyone paying attention. The distillery thrives precisely because it learned to operate without its founder's personal control. The safe itself still exists, displayed in a small museum on the distillery grounds. It sits behind glass, the dent from Jack's kick still visible on the door below the combination dial, a physical artifact of the moment pride became fatal. Thousands of visitors photograph it yearly, not knowing the full context, that the kick represented 45 years of accumulated certainty that control equaled strength, and that admitting weakness equaled failure. Modern Jack Daniel's is valued by Brown-Forman at over $8 billion in brand equity alone, separate from physical assets. That valuation reflects decades of marketing, quality consistency, global distribution, and cultural positioning that Jack began but never could have executed alone. The brand he built from Tennessee cave water has become a symbol of American authenticity, rebellion, and craft. Marketed globally, sold everywhere from Tokyo to Dubai to São Paulo. And none of it required Jack Daniel to be alive. In fact, the empire's greatest growth came long after his death, achieved by managers who valued systems over intuition, documentation over memory, delegation over control. They understood what Jack never accepted. Businesses built to outlive their founders need infrastructure that doesn't depend on genius, just reproducible competence. The workers today earn more, work safer, have benefits and protections their predecessors lacked. The distillery pays millions in local taxes. It's supporting Moore County's budget, far beyond the 30% Jack contributed at peak. The town of Lynchburg, still small at roughly 6,000 residents, is economically sustained by tourism and distillery employment. The relationship between town and business has matured from dependence on one man's will to mutual benefit from institutional stability. Jack Daniel's story is taught in business schools occasionally, usually focused on brand building or Prohibition survival. But the deeper lesson about founder syndrome, succession planning, and the danger of irreplaceable individuals gets less attention. It's uncomfortable, suggesting that visionary founders might be obstacles to their own creation's long-term success. That the same qualities building empires, obsessive control, refusal to compromise, as personal identification with product, can prevent those empires from maturing into institutions. Jack Daniel built something magnificent, but he built it to need him, and that need became its greatest vulnerability. His death was the necessary catastrophe that forced adaptation. Jess Motlow, George Green, and later professional managers did what Jack couldn't. They made the distillery work without depending on any single individual's judgment or presence. Today, no one at the distillery claims they're making Jack Daniel's whiskey the way Jack would have. They're making it according to documented procedures, tested formulas, and quality standards that happen to produce the same result Jack achieved through personal intuition. The romance is gone, replaced by reliability. And reliability, it turns out, builds billion-dollar brands more effectively than genius ever could. The empire outlived its king. That's not tragedy, that's success. But it required the king to die first, to get out of the way, to stop being the bottleneck his own brilliance had created. Jack Daniel couldn't bend, so the world broke him and moved forward. Modern echoes of old pride. From tech founders to industrial CEOs, the Jack Daniel story repeats whenever control replaces trust. The pattern is so common, it has a name: founder syndrome. It appears in garages in Silicon Valley, boardrooms in Manhattan, factories in the Midwest, and startups in every city where someone builds something from nothing and then can't let go. The symptoms are identical across centuries and industries: refusal to delegate, undocumented knowledge, emotional decision-making, and the belief that the organization can't function without its creator's direct involvement. Jack Daniel exhibited every symptom in 1911. Steve Jobs exhibited many of them at Apple in the 1980s before his board forced him out. Travis Kalanick showed them at Uber before investors demanded his resignation. Elizabeth Holmes demonstrated them at Theranos before fraud charges ended her control. The specific circumstances differ, but the underlying psychology is consistent. Brilliant people who create something extraordinary often can't separate their identity from their creation, and that fusion becomes toxic as the organization grows. Consider the modern tech founder, age 32, who's built a company from dorm room idea to $500 million valuation in 6 years. She wrote the original code, designed the user interface, secured the first investors, and hired the early team. The product succeeds because of her vision, her aesthetic judgment, her refusal to ship anything she considers substandard. Employees tell journalists she has to approve every feature, every design change, every marketing campaign. Nothing ships without her sign-off. That's exactly what workers said about Jack Daniel in 1910, and it worked brilliantly until it didn't. The modern founder faces similar warnings that Jack ignored. Investors urge her to hire professional management, to document product requirements, to build systems that don't depend on her personal involvement in every decision. She agrees in principle, hires a COO, establishes procedures, then undermines them by continuing to personally approve everything that matters. The COO becomes a figurehead. The procedures become ignored. Workers learn that the real approval still comes from the founder, so they route everything through her regardless of formal structure. She's creating Jack Daniel's Distillery, an empire that functions only through her constant presence and judgment. And like Jack, she probably believes this is strength, evidence of her commitment and standards. She's wrong, but the feedback loop of success keeps confirming her approach. Revenue grows, the product improves, customers love it. Why change what works? The answer is the same in 2026 as it was in 1911. Because human beings are fragile, mortal, and subject to forces beyond their control. A study by Harvard Business Review in 2022 examined 500 founder-led companies with valuations above $100 million. 68% had no documented succession plan. 42% had critical business knowledge held by founders, but not written down anywhere. 35% had experienced near-miss catastrophes, situations where the founder's unavailability, illness, accident, personal crisis created immediate operational chaos because no one else knew how to make essential decisions. These are Jack Daniel's statistics, repeated across modern business. The consequences play out in predictable ways. Sometimes the founder dies or becomes incapacitated. A car accident, sudden illness, mental health crisis. And the company discovers too late that knowledge was lost. Sometimes investors force removal, deciding the founder has become an obstacle to growth. Sometimes the founder burns out, crushed by the impossibility of maintaining personal control over an organization that's grown beyond individual capacity. In each case, the transition is more painful than necessary because the founder refused to build infrastructure for succession. Just as Jack refused to write down the safe combination, document production procedures, or train people to make decisions without his approval. The modern economy has developed tools to mitigate founder syndrome: board governance, professional management training, succession planning consultants, leadership coaches who specialize in helping founders delegate. These tools work when founders use them sincerely, not as performance to satisfy investors, while maintaining actual control behind the scenes. But tools require acknowledging the problem exists. And founders, by definition, are people who succeeded by trusting their own judgment over conventional wisdom. They built something valuable by ignoring people who said it couldn't be done. That same contrarian streak makes them resistant to advice about relinquishing control. I built this, they think. Why would I hand decisions to someone who doesn't understand it like I do? Jack thought exactly that. He built the distillery from poverty through obsessive mastery. He tasted whiskey better than anyone else, understood the process more completely, cared more deeply about quality. Of course, he shouldn't delegate to people with less expertise, less commitment, less direct connection to the product. Except that reasoning created a single point of failure, and when that point failed, everything collapsed. Consider Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company founded by Yvon Chouinard in 1973. Chouinard built the company around environmental values and quality products, maintaining founder control for decades. But unlike Jack Daniel, Chouinard systematically built institutional capacity to sustain those values without him. He documented decision-making frameworks, trained leadership teams in the company's philosophy, created governance structures that embedded his values in the organization's DNA rather than in his personal judgment. In 2022, at age 83, Chouinard transferred ownership of Patagonia to a trust and nonprofit organization designed to preserve the company's mission in perpetuity. He engineered his own irrelevance deliberately, building systems that would sustain his vision after his death. The company continues operating according to his principles, but doesn't need him personally to make decisions. That's the opposite of Jack Daniel's approach. Jack made himself indispensable. Chouinard made himself obsolete by design. Both loved their creations. Both had strong values about how things should be done. But only one built infrastructure to outlive him while maintaining those values. Or consider Howard Schultz at Starbucks, who stepped away as CEO in 2000, returned in 2008 when the company struggled, stepped away again in 2017, and returned again in 2022 when leadership faltered. Schultz created a company that repeatedly discovers it can't function well without him. Exactly the Jack Daniel pattern. Each return reinforces the belief that Schultz is essential, that his judgment is irreplaceable, i.e. that Starbucks needs its founder's personal involvement to succeed. That might be true in the short term, but it's organizational failure in the long term. Schultz is 71 as of 2026. Eventually he'll die, and Starbucks will either have built capacity to function without him or will face crisis. The longer he remains essential, the harder the transition becomes. He's building the safe Jack Daniel kicked, a structure that seems to protect the organization but actually imprisons it. The pattern appears in family businesses too. A father builds a manufacturing company over 40 years, refuses to retire, won't train his children to take over because they don't understand the business like I do. He dies at 78, and the children discover he never documented supplier relationships, customer preferences, or the tacit knowledge that made operations work. Within 3 years, the company fails, not because the market changed, but because knowledge died with the founder. This happened to countless businesses during COVID-19. Small companies lost founders to the virus and discovered that no one else knew how to access bank accounts, negotiate with suppliers, or manage key customer relationships. The knowledge existed only in one person's mind, and when that person died, the knowledge died too. Jack Daniel's story offers a framework for recognizing founder syndrome before it becomes fatal. Warning sign. 1. Knowledge hoarding. If critical information exists only in the founder's memory, combinations, passwords, supplier contacts, customer preferences, strategic rationale, the organization is vulnerable. Solution: document everything. If it matters enough to remember, it matters enough to write down. Warning sign. 2. Approval bottlenecks. If the founder must personally approve routine decisions, the organization can't scale beyond the founder's available hours. Solution: establish clear decision-making authority at appropriate levels, with the founder setting principles rather than approving specifics. Warning sign 3. No succession plan. If the founder's sudden absence would create immediate crisis, the organization isn't sustainable. Solution: identify and train successors explicitly. Give them real authority while the founder is still available for mentorship, and document transition plans. Warning. Sign 4. Emotional decision-making. If business decisions are driven by the founder's need for control rather than strategic logic, the organization serves the founder's psychology rather than its own interests. Solution: establish governance structures that require justifying decisions based on business criteria, not personal preference. Warning. Sign 5. Resistance to delegation. If the founder claims no one else can do the work properly, that's evidence of training failure, not employee incompetence. Solution: invest in developing people's capabilities rather than protecting the founder's irreplaceability. Jack exhibited all 5 warning signs. Modern founders exhibit them constantly. The difference is that modern founders have access to frameworks, tools, and case studies that make the risks visible. Jack operated in 1911 without business school curriculum or organizational psychology research. Modern founders have no such excuse. Yet the pattern persists because founder syndrome isn't intellectual failure. It's emotional inability to separate self from creation. Jack Daniel didn't refuse succession planning because he couldn't understand the logic. He refused because admitting someone else could make his whiskey felt like admitting his life's work was arbitrary, that his genius wasn't unique, that he was replaceable. That fear is understandable, but it's also fatal. The modern founder facing similar fears has a choice Jack didn't: learn from the past or repeat it. Build institutions that outlive you, or build monuments that die with you. Document knowledge or hoard it. Develop successors or remain essential until you're not. Jack kicked a safe and died of wounded pride because he'd spent 45 years building an empire that couldn't function without him. Modern founders kick different safes: investor relationships, key partnerships, product decisions, strategic directions, and face the same outcome: organizations that collapse when the founder becomes unavailable. The solution isn't complicated, it's just emotionally difficult. Build systems, document knowledge, train successors, delegate authority, and accept that your creation outliving you means letting it grow or beyond your direct control. Jack couldn't do it. The question is whether modern founders, with all available resources and cautionary tales, can do better. The data suggests many can't, but some can. And the difference between those who build empires and those who build prisons is the willingness to make themselves unnecessary, to construct their own obsolescence as the final act of creation. That's the lesson Jack Daniel's life teaches. Not that control is bad, but that control refusing to release becomes catastrophic. Not that founders shouldn't care deeply, but that care must eventually transform into trust. Jack never learned trust. He died locked out of his own empire, killed by the belief that strength meant never admitting weakness. His whiskey outlived him by learning what he couldn't: that institutions built to depend on one person's genius are actually built on that person's fragility. And fragility, given enough time, always breaks. What the safe still guards, the safe Jack Daniel kicked, still exists, empty but instructive. It sits in a climate-controlled display case at the Jack Daniel's Visitor Center in Lynchburg, surrounded by other artifacts from the distillery's history: original bottles, awards from world fairs, photographs of workers from the 1890s, tools used in early production. The safe is unremarkable physically: black iron, maybe 4 feet tall, manufactured by Chattanooga Safe Company, serial number long since faded. But the dent is visible, a depression in the steel door about 8 inches below the combination dial, exactly where a boot toe would connect if someone kicked it in frustration. Tour guides tell the story dozens of times daily to visitors who file through, cameras ready, snapping photos of the dent that killed a man. The narrative has been polished through repetition. Jack Daniel forgot the combination one morning, kicked the safe in anger, broke his toe, and the infection eventually killed him. It gets laughs, knowing chuckles about stubborn old-timers who refused medical help. The guides frame it as colorful history, an amusing footnote to a success story about American entrepreneurship and quality craftsmanship. What they rarely discuss is what the story actually means. The safe is empty now, its combination reset or removed entirely. Whatever it once protected, business records, cash, legal documents, has long since been archived, digitized, or destroyed. But metaphorically, the safe still guards something: the central question of Jack Daniel's life and death. How many empires are still locked behind someone's pride? Not just business empires. Family legacies where patriarchs refuse to share authority until dementia makes the choice for them. Creative projects where artists won't collaborate because no one else understands the vision properly. The scientific research where principal investigators hoard data because sharing might mean someone else gets credit. Marriages where one partner controls finances because the other doesn't handle money well. Friendships that end because neither person will admit fault first. The pattern is everywhere humans build something and then fuse their identity with it so completely that releasing control feels like dying. Jack wasn't unusual. He was typical of people who escape poverty or limitation through mastery, who learn that competence equals safety, who build walls of control to protect themselves from the helplessness they experienced before they gained power. His tragedy was ordinary. What made it visible was that he built his control into an industrial operation, making the personal psychological pattern into documented business history. But walk through any organization, any family, any community, and you'll find smaller versions of the same safe. Knowledge one person holds but won't share. Authority one person wields but won't delegate. Relationships one person controls but won't make mutual. And beside each safe, visible if you look closely, you'll see the dents. The moments when inability to access what's locked inside triggered rage, desperation, or quiet resignation. Sometimes those dents are literal. A parent dying without sharing account passwords, leaving children locked out of assets they need to settle an estate. Sometimes they're metaphorical. A mentor who never trains a successor because it would mean admitting obsolescence, leaving an organization helpless when they retire or die. The question isn't whether we'll all face moments like Jack faced that morning in 1911, forgetting something we thought we'd always know, losing access to something we thought we controlled. The question is whether we'll have built backup systems, documented knowledge, trained successors, and structures that allow others to step in when we inevitably fail. Jack's story suggests most of us won't, because building those systems requires admitting we're not essential. An admission of non-essentialness feels like admission of worthlessness. If anyone can do what we do, what makes us valuable? If our knowledge is transferable, what makes us special? If our judgment isn't uniquely necessary, why does anyone need us? These are the questions that make succession planning emotionally impossible, even when it's intellectually obvious. But here's what Jack's story also reveals. The empire that outlived him succeeded precisely because it stopped depending on his uniqueness. The whiskey tastes the same whether made by Jack Daniel or by workers following documented procedures. The brand thrives whether managed by its founder or by professional executives at Brown-Forman. The distillery employs more people, serves more customers, and generates more value without Jack than it ever did with him. Which means Jack's fear that making himself unnecessary would make him worthless was exactly backward. Making himself necessary made him a bottleneck. Making himself irreplaceable made the entire operation fragile. His refusal to build systems that could function without him limited the distillery's potential while he lived and nearly destroyed it when he died. The real tragedy isn't that Jack kicked the safe. It's that he spent 45 years building an organization structured like that safe, designed to protect value, but actually imprisoning it, requiring his personal access to function, and vulnerable to catastrophic failure the moment he couldn't perform his role. How many of us are doing exactly that right now? The entrepreneur who won't write down standard operating procedures because my employees should just know how we do things. The parent who won't teach adult children about family finances because I'm still handling it. The professor who won't share data sets because that's my research, I collected it. The executive who won't document strategic rationale because if they can't figure it out, they shouldn't be in leadership. Each of these is a small version of Jack's safe, a refusal to make knowledge transferable, disguised as protection of value or maintenance of standards. And each creates the same vulnerability. When the person holding knowledge becomes unavailable, the knowledge becomes inaccessible, and whatever depended on that knowledge breaks. Jack died of blood poisoning triggered by a broken toe, but the broken toe was triggered by a forgotten combination. And the forgotten combination was merely the visible symptom of a 45-year pattern of refusing to build redundancy, documentation, or succession infrastructure. He didn't die from kicking the safe. He died from living his entire life as though he'd never need backup systems, never forget anything important, never become unavailable, is never be wrong about the necessity of his personal control. The safe guards that lesson, if we're willing to see it. 300,000 visitors tour the Jack Daniel's Distillery annually. They see the cave spring flowing, the charcoal mellowing house, the barrel warehouses stretching across hillsides. They taste samples of whiskey, buy bottles in the gift shop, and take photos beside the safe with the dent. Most leave entertained, impressed by the scale of modern operations, charmed by small-town Tennessee hospitality. Very few leave thinking about their own safes, the knowledge they're hoarding, the control they're refusing to share, the succession plans they're avoiding, the documentation they're not creating. Very few ask themselves, what combination am I refusing to write down? What will break when I inevitably forget it? That's unfortunate because Jack Daniel's real gift to business history isn't the whiskey recipe or the branding strategy. It's the cautionary clarity of what happens when brilliant people build empires that can't survive them. He created something magnificent. He also created something fragile. And the fragility wasn't in the whiskey or the market or the politics. It was in the structure itself, built deliberately to require him, to channel all authority through him, to function only as long as he remained present and competent. When he kicked the safe, he was kicking against his own mortality, his own aging, his own human limitations. The safe didn't budge because steel doesn't care about human pride. And the infection that followed was just biology teaching the same lesson. Bodies don't care how much you need them to work. They fail according to their own logic, not yours. Jack spent 6 months dying of a lesson he'd refused to learn for 45 years. That lesson is still available, still sitting in a display case in Lynchburg, Tennessee, still visible to anyone willing to look past the entertainment value and see the warning. Make yourself unnecessary. Document your knowledge. Train your successors. Build systems that outlive you. Because the alternative isn't staying essential forever. The alternative is becoming a bottleneck that eventually breaks, taking down everything that depended on you when you fall. Jack Daniel's Distillery survived its founder and became more successful without him than with him. That's not an insult to Jack's genius. It's proof that genius embedded in institutions outlasts genius trapped in individuals. The empire outlived the king. The whiskey outlived the distiller. The brand outlived the founder. And all of that happened because Jack Daniel finally, fatally, got out of the way. The safe still sits in Lynchburg, dented and empty, guarding the question each of us must answer for ourselves. What are we protecting through control that would actually thrive through release? What empire are we imprisoning behind our own pride? What combination are we refusing to write down? And when we inevitably forget, when age or illness or accident or death makes us unavailable, what will break because we never built systems to survive our absence? Jack never answered those questions. He kicked the safe instead. And the safe, unchanging and unmoved, taught him what he'd refused to learn, that strength isn't refusing to bend. Strength is building something that doesn't need you to stay strong. The dent remains visible. The lesson remains available. The choice remains ours. Some empires kill their founders long before the market ever does. Jack Daniel proved that. Whether we repeat his story or learn from it depends entirely on whether we're willing to admit we're not essential, and then build like we believe it.